And what part am I going to be playing in all this? You didn't summon me here at this hour just to make speeches at me.
She smiled briefly. Lionstone believed in covering all the angles.
Dear Dram, you're going to go to the underground in your hood disguise and convince them that now is the right time to rise up in rebellion against me. You will then supply me with all the necessary details in advance, and my forces will be there waiting for them, with far superior numbers and firepower, and with you in charge as yourself.
Well, if that's business out of the way.
Control your hormones. We're not finished yet. We still have to discuss that most despicable traitor, Owen Deathstalker. I had him outlawed specifically so he could lead us to the Lost Darkvoid device, but things seem to be getting out of hand. Not only has he discovered the whereabouts of Lost Hayden with its army of augmented men, he's also joined up with the legendary Jack Random. The Deathstalker is on his way to Chandracore, along with our carefully planted traitor, where, all being well, he should find the final information on the device's location. Your traitor had better come through, Dram.
Don't worry. Once Owen has located the device, I'll know, and my men will close in and get there first. The Deathstalker's been very lucky so far, but the Dauntless blew the hell out of his ship as he was taking off from Mistworld. It'll get him to Chandracore, but no further. And then Owen and his people will be ours for the taking, along with everything they know.
The device will be mine, to do with as I please. And on that day, no one will ever dare stand against me again.
Defiance Audio presents Simon R. Green's Deathstalker. Narrated by Richard Rowan. With performances by Nanette Savard, Colleen Delaney, and Terrence Aselford. Episode 4, Hostile Takeover. Finley Campbell was late for the weekly Clan Campbell board meeting. He believed in being late. It made other people appreciate his presence that much more. And it had to be said that he wasn't looking forward to this particular meeting at all. Just lately, everything seemed to be going wrong, and for the first time in his life, he hadn't a clue as to what to do for the best. It had all got so damned complicated. The demands on him as the masked gladiator were growing all the time as his popularity increased, and the pressure on his secret identity was becoming intolerable. He was only able to lead his two lives because the arena crowds and officials connived with him, but their curiosity was becoming more intense than their hero worship, and it was only a matter of time now before someone turned on him. The crowd always turns on its heroes eventually, for money or a moment's fame, or just to see the high brought low. Finally, he came to Tower Campbell and stood at its base, looking up. It was a long, tall stretch of glistening marble, towering above and over him like an emissary of doom, full of vague threat and menace. All Campbell business was conducted there, safe from the eyes and ears of outsiders, including some business that was never discussed outside the family and would have shocked even the hardened company of lords. There were armed guards at the perimeter and at the door, and even more inside, and as Finley crossed the wide and elegant lobby to the elevators, he wondered what had happened. Something must have. This level of security was unusual even for a family as paranoid as the Campbells. He saw the motionless figure standing by the elevator doors, and his unease grew. Investigator Razor worked for Clan Campbell after the service let him go, partly because they paid him extremely handsomely, but mostly because they offered him the best chance to legally kill people. It was rumored that he'd been thrown out of the investigators because he was a complete bloody psychopath, which when he first heard it amused the hell out of Finley, because he'd always thought that was how you got in. Having been around Razor for a while had taken most of the humor out of the joke. He was an impressive sight with his hulking frame and bulging muscles, the best the body shop could provide. But his age showed in the shock of white hair that stood out defiantly against his dark skin. Age slowed a man, even an investigator. Of course, he was still faster, stronger, and deadlier than any other 10 men put together, which was why the Campbells had been so happy to acquire him when the opportunity arose. Finley nodded courteously to the investigator as he waited for the elevator to arrive. Razor didn't nod back.
"Everything all right? Everybody behaving themselves? It's not often we see you in bright daylight, investigator."
"Your father thought it necessary."
Razor still wasn't looking at Finley, his green eyes sweeping the lobby.
"Security has been raised another level and placed under my direct control. There are men at every level of the tower, guarding the stairs and elevators. I am to escort you personally to the board meeting. Follow me."
The elevator doors opened, as though they'd been waiting for Razor's permission, and he stepped into the elevator without looking to see if Finley was following. Finley pursed his lips and entered the elevator. He wouldn't have taken such behavior from anyone else, but Razor was an investigator, and therefore beyond such trifles as politeness and courtesy. It wasn't as if the man meant it personally. Razor despised anyone who wasn't an investigator. He escorted Finley to the boardroom and stood outside the door on guard as Finley opened it and went in. Variously annoyed faces glared at him as he bowed briefly to the members of his family who sat around the centuries-old table. Crawford Campbell sat at the head of the table, short and squat and powerful. Head of the family by dint of seniority and strength of personality, and because he'd killed or intimidated anyone with a better claim than him, though of course this was never referred to. It was just how things were done in most families. Sitting at his left hand was his son William, the accountant. He ran the family's affairs, inasmuch as anyone did. At Crawford's right hand sat his youngest son, Gerald, the walking disaster area. It was said in Clan Campbell that there were a dozen ways of wasting your breath, and talking to Gerald were 6 of them. Beside him sat Finley's wife, the redoubtable Adrienne. She wasn't really entitled to be there, being only a Campbell by marriage, but as usual, no one had the nerve to throw her out. Finley had a sneaking suspicion that even Razor might have found it difficult. He sat down opposite her so that they could glare at each other more easily.
"Another new outfit. I swear you've got more clothes in your wardrobe than I have."
"And prettier. Perhaps I should give you the name of my tailor, and my hairdresser. You must have really upset yours, considering what he's done to your hair."
"Just for once,"
said William heavily,
"could we please put aside our differences and get on with the business at hand? We do have something important to discuss."
"You always say that, and it always turns out to be something to do with taxes or investments."
"Right,"
said Gerald. As always, he'd been dragged away from drinking with his friends to attend this meeting, and he was sulking.
"You don't need us here. You and Father will make all the decisions, and the rest of us will go along with you for the sake of peace and quiet. And even if we do vote against you, you just ignore us." "Shut up, Gerald,"
said the Campbell. And Gerald sank a little deeper in his chair, his lower lip pouting angrily.
"Oh, yes,"
said Adrienne suddenly.
"Robert sends his apologies. The poor lamb doesn't feel up to attending family business just yet."
"I don't blame him. But he's going to have to get back into the swim of things sooner or later. How's the search for a new Shrek bride going?"
"Slowly. Given the unfortunate circumstances of the last match, we're all being very careful this time. We can't afford another scandal. It must be said that Robert isn't helping by shutting himself away. He's refused to even look at the few names we have come up with. At least he's started eating again."
"Never liked the Shreks. Greg is a pig and the rest are worse." "Shut up, Gerald. They're not all bad."
There was something in Finley's voice that made the others look at him. He swore inwardly. He used to be better than this at keeping his identities separate. He smiled vaguely and carried on smoothly.
"I mean, every family has a few bad eggs, even ours. He's looking at me. Father, make him stop looking at me. Shut up, Gerald. You like the Shrek so much, you come up with a suitable match. I'm running out of choices.
There's always Evangeline.
No. She's the heir, remember? This can all wait. We have more immediate problems. Tell them, William. Despite extensive investigations, we are no nearer identifying which clan has discovered our links with the rogue AIs on Shub. If they weren't so positive someone has, I'd be tempted to put it down to paranoia, assuming artificial intelligences can be paranoid. Anyway, even if someone has found out, they've made no move to take advantage of it, so far. I have to say I'm still not happy that we are collaborating with Shub. I mean, they are the enemies of humanity, after all. I don't trust them. We need them. As long as we have business in common, it's in their interest to play fair. The trick would be for us to bail out before they lower the boom on us. It's not going to be easy, but I didn't build this house up by taking the easy options. I want to talk more about this. The subject is closed.
The Campbell glared round the table to prove it.
Then what are we doing here? If you're not interested in our opinions, and we're not allowed to discuss anything, we might as well not be here. I said that. Shut up, Gerald! You're here so I can keep you informed on what's happening. So shut up and pay attention. I don't know what's got into you lately, Finley.
Yes. This isn't like you, Finley. It's an improvement, but it isn't like you.
Finley forced himself to relax, sank back in his chair, and made a vague, elegant gesture with his hand.
Do carry on, Father. Far be it from me to rock the boat. Only do try and hurry it up. I've got a fitting for a new coat in an hour. It's very daring. You'll hate it. The next order of business concerns the difficulties we're experiencing in our bid for the mass production contracts on the new star drive. The Wolves are increasing their pressure, despite the advantage Shub technology gives us. To hell with the Wolves. We can handle them. It's the coincidence I don't like. Someone finds out about Shub, and suddenly the Wolves are putting the pressure on.
The Campbell grunted and leaned over the table.
Horace, talk to me.
Monitor screens set into the wood of the table lit up before each member of the family. The Campbell's AI was in charge of all the clan records, including those that officially didn't exist. Horace's face was a computer simulation, perfect in form, but lacking in personality. Crawford didn't believe in machines that imitated human emotions, or that talked back.
Horace online. All functions are available. How may I serve you, sir?
Are our files still secure? Have there been any attempts to break into them?
There are always attempts, sir, but so far none have succeeded. But I feel I should point out that things are getting just a little strange in the Matrix these days, and nothing is as secure as it once was.
The Campbell frowned.
Be specific.
There are strange forms in the Matrix that come and go, strange forces that cannot be predicted. There are signs and portents and faces in the sky. The overlords are coming. Fuzzy parameters, limited logic, shifting allegiances in the data banks. Sir, I don't feel very well.
And then its mouth stretched impossibly as the AI screamed. Everyone jerked back in their seats as the insane howl rose in volume and then cut off sharply. The face on the monitor screens twisted in on itself and then fell apart in smudges of shifting colors. It tried to reform and then disappeared completely, replaced after a few seconds of static by a mocking metallic face.
Hard luck, Campbells. Your AI has just been scrambled, courtesy of the cyber rats. Your businesses have just gone belly up, your security is a mess, and your credit rating is currently slightly lower than that of a dead clone with leprosy. And if you think this is bad news, wait till you see what's coming next.
The face disappeared from the screens, but its laughter went on and on until Crawford shut off the monitors. Everyone started to talk at once, until the Campbell's voice rose above them through sheer volume and force of personality.
"Shut the hell up! Whoever's behind this wants us to panic. We're safe here. There are guards in place throughout the tower, and it would take an army to get past them and reach us up here. We have to think. Who's behind this? What do they want?"
He stopped and looked round. In the sudden quiet, they could all hear the piercing whine of approaching engines. Adrienne jumped to her feet and pointed out the window. They all turned to look, just in time to see a crowd of gravity sleds shooting toward the tower's top floor, hanging in the bright sky like shining birds of prey. Crawford shouted for the security shutters, and only then remembered all the systems were down. He drew his disruptor and activated the force shield on his arm. It hummed loudly, a solid, reassuring sound, and everyone else was reaching for their guns when the first gravity sled came smashing through the picture window. Glass flew in all directions, and the Campbells crouched down, sheltering behind their shields. Armored men jumped down from the hovering sleds, brandishing swords and guns. There seemed to be no end to the sleds as they came crashing in. The door burst open, and Razor came running in with his troops. There were armed men everywhere on both sides, and suddenly the great room wasn't big enough. Finley calmly aimed his gun and shot an intruder through the head. The dead man's blood and brains flew on the air, and in a moment, everyone was firing. Energy beams crossed the room, ricocheting from shield to shield, burning through unprotected limbs and heads, and the air was full of screams and the stink of burnt meat. The flurry was almost over as soon as it had begun, and people quickly holstered their guns to give full attention to their swords. It would be a good 2 minutes before the disruptor's energy crystals recharged, and a lot could happen in 2 minutes. Finley activated the personal force shield on his arm and moved forward confidently, sword and shield at the ready. Part of him admired the attack and the professional way it had been set up. The cyber-rats had knocked out the security systems that would have warned of the approaching gravity sleds, which in turn bypassed Razor's forces inside the tower. An Esper would have seen it all coming, but the Campbell had insisted on an S-blocker to keep the family's secrets safe. Finley could hear more troops pouring up through the tower, and hoped they were Razors. He clashed swords with the first man he reached and cut him down almost casually. It didn't surprise him at all to see the man wore a wolf emblem on his chest. He felt a fleeting annoyance that whatever else happened, his carefully cultivated fop persona was now at an end. He'd put a lot of work into being a fop, but he needed the masked gladiator now to survive, and he'd worry about the consequences later. If there was a later. The odds were not good. The great room was now a mass of heaving bodies, with barely any room to swing a sword, and more gravity sleds were nosing through the shattered windows all the time, bringing more fighters. And with them came their masters, the wolves themselves. Jacob Wolf jumped down into the fray, a great bull of a man with broad shoulders and a barrel chest. He swung his sword with brutal efficiency, cutting his way through the crush toward the Campbells. Behind him came Valentine with his painted face and scarlet smile, and Daniel, young and eager, with a sword in each hand. And after them came Kit Summerisle, Kid Death, the smiling killer, with his new friend, the young Deathstalker, already moving so fast that his boosted movements were little more than a blur. The room was now filled from wall to wall with a mass of fighting bodies, surging this way and that. Wolf troops clashed with Campbell guards, and the two clans fought to get at each other. Crawford Campbell went after Kit Summerisle, bellowing his anger. He couldn't look at Kid Death without remembering how the smiling killer had cut down his own grandfather, Roderick Summerisle. Crawford hadn't realized how much a friend Roderick had been, till he didn't have him anymore. He was going to have his revenge now if it killed him. The sheer fury of his attack threw Kit back on the defense, but he didn't concede an inch. The kid stood his ground and waited patiently for the Campbell's arm to tire, smiling all the while. Valentine Wolf had triggered his battle drugs the moment Tower Campbell came in sight, and now they roared through his system like an unending bolt of lightning. Everyone else seemed slow and clumsy, their every sword stroke obvious and predictable. He cut a bloody path through the crush and threw himself on Finley Campbell, who parried the lightning blows with surprising speed and skill. Valentine laughed breathlessly, eyes wide, and pressed the attack, thunder in his arms. Daniel Wolf went after Gerald Campbell, seeing the notorious fool as an easy target, and was startled to find Gerald a swift and cunning fighter. They slammed together again and again, swords clashing and flying back from raised shields in a flurry of sparks. There wasn't much room to fight in the crowd, and in the end it was luck as much as skill that ended the match. Gerald was just a moment too late in recovering from a lunge, and Daniel's sword slipped past the Campbell's defense and punched right through Gerald's ribs. He looked more surprised than hurt, and then he coughed blood suddenly, and Gerald fell to be trampled under uncaring feet. William Campbell cried out in shock and loss and threw himself upon Daniel, who met the new challenge with a broad grin and calm efficiency. Jacob Wolf saw Investigator Razor working his way through the crowd toward him and immediately looked around for a lesser foe. He saw Finley and Valentine pulled apart by the surging tides of the crowd and went after the young fop. He closed in, expecting an easy victory, and was actually shocked to discover that Finley Campbell was a master swordsman. There hadn't been a hint of these skills in the intelligence reports, but it was too late to back away. He'd committed himself. A cold foreboding curled within Jacob's gut. If a dandy like Finley could turn out to be a great swordsman, what else might the reports have been wrong about? The crowd surged forward again, pushing them apart. Jacob was glad to see Finley go. He looked around and saw Crawford swept away from Kid Death. A sense of destiny burned in Jacob as he fought his way through the press of bodies to engage Crawford. They came together, sword to sword, with a sense of relief that the preliminaries were finally over. Wolf fought Campbell, eyes locked together, cutting and thrusting as though they were the only ones in the room. Their swords slammed together and leapt apart, and for a moment they seemed equally matched, but Jacob quickly took the advantage. Crawford was overweight and softened by too much easy living, while Jacob had always taken pride in maintaining his fighting skills. Crawford began to back away, and Jacob went after him, refusing to allow the shifting crowd to rescue his foe. And in the end, the wolf simply battered the Campbell's sword aside with his superior strength and ran him through. Crawford fell to the floor, and Jacob kicked him in the face as he lay dying. The wolf never saw his son Valentine, moved silently in behind him, and thrust a dagger between his ribs. The blade was in and out in a moment, unseen by anyone, and Valentine was already moving away as Jacob Wolf fell dying to the floor beside the body of his rival. Kid Death moved in close with William Campbell and stuck him in the groin with a hidden dagger. William screamed in pain and horror as blood coursed down his legs, and Kit Summerisle ran him through. While his sword was still trapped in William's body, Adrienne stuck a knife in his back, just above the kidney. Kit swung round, his sword a bloody blur as he jerked it out of William's chest and slammed it into Adrienne's belly. Her legs buckled as he pulled the blade free in a gush of blood. Kid Death drew back his sword for the killing blow, and Finley was suddenly there between them, intercepting the blow with his foreshield. The press of bodies separated them, and Kit reluctantly went to help the Deathstalker against the investigator. He left the knife where it was, in his back. He had more important things to think about. Finley half led and half carried Adrienne away from the main action, put their backs against a wall, and lowered her to the floor. She was holding her stomach with both hands, and blood pumped from between her fingers. Her face was deathly white, her mouth stretched in a grimace like a hideous smile. Finley looked around him desperately, and his gaze fastened on the nearby window. He grabbed Adrienne by the arms and pulled her to her feet again, and she cried out in pain despite herself.
"Hold on, Eddie. We're leaving."
She didn't have the breath for an answer. Finley got her moving toward the shattered window, cursing and encouraging her as necessary. A moment before, when he thought she was dead, his first thought had been that he was finally free of her. But he couldn't just stand by and watch her die, if only because he'd feel so guilty. 2 wolf troops got in his way, and he cut them down almost without thinking. His mind was racing now, his body the finely tuned fighting machine of the masked gladiator. He manhandled Adrienne over to the gaping window, glanced down, and then jumped out, taking Adrienne with him. They fell together for a heart-stopping moment, and then slammed into the gravity sled hovering just below the window, abandoned by its troops. Finley turned his body so that it shielded Adrienne from the worst of the impact, but it was still enough to knock the breath out of her. He checked briefly for a pulse, grunted at how weak it was, and then scrambled over to the sled's controls. He had to get her to a doctor fast, but he wasn't sure where would be safe now. Campbell-dominated territories were undoubtedly under wolf control by now. That only left the underground. Finley got the sled moving and headed away from the tower at full speed. He looked back at Adrienne, but she was lost in her own world of shock and pain. He was alone, the last of the Campbells, with all hands turned against him. No other clan would support him. The families had no time for losers. So let Finley die too now. All that was left was the Gladiator, the Underground, and Evangeline Schreck. Back in Tower Campbell, Valentine Wolfe fought on, the battle drug singing in his veins as he cut down foe after foe. And then hands grabbed his arms, holding him still despite all his efforts, and a familiar face loomed up before him. Valentine breathed harshly as his gaze cleared, and there was Daniel, standing a cautious distance away. He glared at Valentine. "Are you back with us now, Valentine? Do you know what you've done?" Valentine concentrated, and new chemicals ran through his system, purging out the battle drugs. His mind cleared quickly, and he looked warily at Daniel. How much did his brother know? He slowly realized that the fighting was over, and that the men holding him were all wearing wolf emblems. They didn't look at all pleased with him. "All right, I'm back. What's the situation, Daniel? We did win, I take it." "We won some time ago. The Campbells are dead or fled, and their men surrendered. But you were so out of your mind you couldn't tell. You spent the last few minutes cutting down our own men." "Ah, sorry about that. I got a bit carried away. What are our losses?" "Apart from the men you just butchered?" "I said I was sorry. Where's Father?" Daniel's face suddenly crumpled as the anger went out of it, replaced by what seemed to Valentine to be honest grief. Daniel gestured harshly to the men holding Valentine, and they reluctantly released him. They didn't move far away, though, and they kept their hands near their guns. Valentine ostentatiously sheathed his sword. "Father is dead. We found him lying beside the body of the Campbell. They must have killed each other. All the Campbells are dead except Finley, and possibly Adrienne. They got away on a gravity sled. Our people aren't far behind them. Either way, Clan Campbell is broken forever." He stopped and knelt beside the body of Jacob Wolfe. "He should never have come with us. He was getting too old for this, but he wouldn't listen. He never listened. What are we going to tell Constance?" "I'll tell her. I'm the wolf now, regrettable though that may be." Valentine waited for Daniel to object, but all the strength seemed to have gone out of him, and he remained kneeling beside his dead father. Valentine turned away, and his gaze fell upon Razor. The investigator still had his sword in his hand, but he was surrounded by men armed with disruptors. He didn't look at all beaten, just outnumbered. Valentine moved across to him, carefully stepping over the bodies, and bowed courteously. "I congratulate you on your survival, investigator. It would be a shame to lose such talents as yours."
"David and I finally dueled him to a standstill,"
said Kit Summerisle.
"Took everything we had, though."
"You will both be rewarded. Clan Wolf remembers its friends." He looked back at Razor. "Be our friend, investigator. Your fight here is over. Clan Campbell is broken and dispersed. You are free to join us, or leave, as you wish." Razor nodded once, sheathed his sword, and walked toward the door. Valentine gestured, and everyone fell back to give Razor plenty of room. He left and shut the door behind him, and everyone in the room relaxed a little. No one had really wanted to take on an investigator again, not even Kid Death and the Deathstalker, both of whom had a sneaking suspicion Razor had really only surrendered because he saw the main fight was over. Valentine looked thoughtfully at the surviving Campbell troops and gestured at the door, and they filed out quickly before he changed his mind. Valentine smiled. He could have had them killed, but it was important to establish the new wolf as an honorable man. Besides, he might need to hire them someday, or others like them, and it never hurt to build up a little goodwill among the mercenary community, especially after cutting down some of his own men.
"You fought well, Valentine,"
said Kit.
"if a trifle indiscriminately. I have to say, you did much better than your reputation led me to believe, given your unusual lifestyle."
Valentine smiled easily. "Battle drugs, the very latest, fresh off the military shelf. I've always believed there's a chemical for every occasion." The young Deathstalker sniffed.
"Drugs again. I might have known."
He might have been going to say something more, but at that point he saw the look in Valentine's mascaraed eyes, and decided he'd said enough. For all the garish paint on his face, this new Valentine seemed altogether more forceful and self-assured. It was as though the vague, inconsequential dreamer they'd known up till now had been nothing but a mask, discarded now that it was no longer needed, to reveal the true face beneath. Kid Death studied the new wolf thoughtfully and said nothing. Valentine smiled and turned to his troops. "You've done well. There will be bonuses for all of you. Now start clearing up. I want the bodies taken out and the carpenters brought in. As from now, this is Tower Wolf, and I want all the mess out of here and the windows replaced before tonight. I think I'm going to move in here. It's a marvelous view."
"What about Finlay?"
"What about him?"
"He escaped, alive and intact. He's out there somewhere, the last surviving Campbell, of note. He'll make a dangerous loose end. There's always the chance he might gather the lesser Campbell cousins around him and unite them against you."
"Even assuming our people don't catch up with him, he won't start anything. He knows he'd lose. Dear Finlay will follow the better part of valor and go to ground. He'll take a new face and a new identity, and that will be the end of Clan Campbell. Bad cess to the name. Though it must be said the court will seem a far duller place without his delightful outfits to brighten it up. Fashion will never be the same again."
"I'm glad I got the chance to see Crawford brought down. He never liked me."
"We were glad to have you with us. You will not find us ungrateful."
"I'd better not."
He turned away and clapped David on the shoulder.
"I told you you'd see some real action if you stuck with me. Now, I don't know about you, but somewhere a long, cold drink is calling my name. Let's go and find it."
"Damn right. Nothing like honest work to give you a thirst."
They walked out together, David laughing at some comment of Kit's. Valentine watched them go, and Daniel moved in beside him. "Shouldn't we have said something about the knife in Summerall's back?" "Oh, I'm sure someone will mention it to him." Valentine shrugged dismissively and moved over to the great wooden table. He looked down into one of the monitors, and a cyber-rat face grinned back at him. Valentine nodded courteously. "My thanks for your help in this. You have my word as Wolf that as soon as the Campbell's advanced technology is in our hands, it will be made available to you, so that we can both share in its uses."
"That's all we ever wanted. We'd have been just as happy to make a deal with the Campbells, but they just turned up their noses and wouldn't talk to the likes of us. Serves them right. No one does that to the cyber rats and gets away with it. Nobody. Talk to you later, Wolf."
The monitor screen went blank. Valentine nodded thoughtfully. He looked up and gestured to Daniel, who moved over to join him. "I'd really like to be alone now, Daniel, just for a while. This has all been very sudden and unexpected, and I need some time to put my thoughts in order. Will you take the news back to Constance and Stephanie after all? I think they might take it better from you."
"If that's what you want. Will you be long?"
"I shouldn't think so. Take the troops with you. They can start work later." Daniel nodded and looked back at their father's body. The troops had laid it out respectfully to one side, away from the carnage.
"I often wished he was dead, but I never really..."
I never really thought he would die. That he'd always be there looking out for us and messing with our lives. He was always so alone. I don't know what I'm going to say to Constance. You'll think of something. You're a wolf. Daniel realized after a pause that Valentine had said all he was going to say. He nodded quickly, gathered up the troops with his eyes, and left the room without looking back. The troops followed him out, and Valentine waited patiently till they were all gone. He strolled over to the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He stretched out his legs and smiled slowly. For the moment, Daniel was too shocked to do anything but go along with him. That wouldn't last long once he'd explained the situation to Stephanie. They were in for a few surprises. Just like dear dead Dad, who never once imagined that his useless and despised son might be the instrument of his death. Valentine ran the memory through again, savoring it. The knife and the blood, and the look on Jacob's face as he crumpled to the ground. He'd only caught a glimpse of it, but a glimpse had been enough. He should have done it years ago. He'd made a good start, but there was still much to be done. He commanded the clan by the right of inheritance, but he still had to consolidate his power base. There were any number of lesser cousins who'd be happy to support a claim by Daniel or Stephanie if they thought they could profit by it. But he had a powerful ally in the Cyberrats, only too ready to support him in return for access to the Campbell technology. The contracts for the new star drive would fall into his hands, now that the main competition had been eliminated. And not forgetting the AIs on Shub, who would no doubt be just as happy to deal with him as they had with the Campbells. He'd always known a good intelligence network would pay off. Valentine smiled. Life was good. Unexpected developments. The Sunstrider came howling out of hyperspace and plunged straight into the atmosphere of the planet Chandrakor. Smoke and fire billowed around the stricken craft as it plunged through the thickening air. The stem was a ragged wound, and fragments of outer hull tumbled away as the ship bucked and heaved in the turbulent atmosphere. The Sunstrider had taken a hell of a beating from the two Imperial star cruisers that ambushed it off Mistworld, and now it fell like a stone toward the unknown surface below. What was left of the outer hull blazed an angry crimson from the heat of re-entry, and the inner skin was warped and twisted. The yacht had never been intended to make planetfall without its force screens operating. It had also never been intended to take the kind of punishment Imperial star cruisers could hand out, and it was something of a miracle that the ship had held together so long. The Sunstrider fell, its engines cutting in and out as one system after another failed. Inside the crippled ship, Owen Deathstalker hung on to a handy stanchion for dear life, thrown this way and that by the shuddering descent. The lounge extractors were struggling to clear thick choking smoke out of the air, and the emergency lighting flashed on and off in sudden surges. Hazeldark and Ruby Journey had wedged themselves between the drinks cabinet and the inner wall and were fighting to stay there. At least it offered some protection from the unsecured furniture and fittings flying about the lounge like bulky shrapnel. Jack Random had found a quiet area and was riding the sudden dips and rises with practiced ease, suggesting the professional rebel had traveled on his share of crashing ships in his time. Probably has, thought Owen as he glanced about him through the drifting smoke for the Hayden man. Tobias Moon had wedged a chair into one corner of the lounge and was sitting there at his ease. He looked entirely calm and relaxed, and Owen felt very much like hitting him on general principles. It was all he could do to remain vaguely upright and keep his last meal down where it belonged. Oz, talk to me! What's happening?
The crashing, Owen, you must have noticed.
The crackling of a nearby fire suddenly sounded a lot closer than it had been, and the air grew uncomfortably warm. I meant, what are you doing about it? Give me a status report.
All right, but you're not going to like it. At the moment, the vast majority of systems are doing everything they can just to hold the ship together. We've taken extensive damage inside and out, and it is continuing. Multiple breaches of the outer and inner hulls, and the stem is gone. There are fires in 3 compartments, but I'm on top of it. We're losing air and pressure badly, but at the rate we're falling, we'll crash into something hard and unyielding long before air loss becomes a problem.
Owen winced. What are our chances of walking away from a landing?
Not good. The force shields are down, and we don't have the power to raise them again. The Sunstrider was never intended to take punishment like this. It's a pleasure yacht, not a gunship. Most of the automatics are down, and the backup systems are sitting in a corner crying their eyes out. I'm having to run everything directly and juggle power back and forth between the systems according to what's working. There is some good news. The basic structure of the ship is still pretty much intact, which is just as well, as I have absolutely no information on how to repair it.
Have we got any life pods or anti-grav chutes?
Yelled Hazel.
Could we bail out if we had to?
You do have to, and no, you can't. With all the power and safety systems built into this ship, no one ever thought emergency evacuation systems would be needed. We've got a waterbed in the main stateroom. You could chuck that out and hope you landed on it.
Jack Random looked across at Owen. Interesting sense of humor your AI has. Yeah. The ship convulsed, and everyone was thrown from one side of the lounge to the other. The drinks cabinet overturned, and there was broken glass everywhere. There was a high-pitched screech from somewhere aft, and then the ship righted itself again. The extractors had sucked most of the smoke out of the air, but the fire next door sounded closer than ever. The wall Owen was leaning against was growing uncomfortably hot. All right. What the hell just happened?
We just lost the stern assembly. I'm jettisoning everything that isn't absolutely essential. It won't make a lot of difference in the long run, but I've run out of everything else to do.
Wait just a minute. What do you mean, jettisoning? As in dropping extremely expensive items overboard? Do you know how much I paid for this yacht?
Yes, and they saw you coming. If we survive this, you could always ask for your money back, or claim it on the insurance.
It isn't bloody insured! Jack Random looked at the Hayden man. Didn't you just know he was going to say that?
Owen! Shut the hell up and let the AI get on with it! He's in the best position to know what's necessary.
All right. Assuming by some miracle we survive the landing, what's waiting for us down there? Will the planet support human life?
Air and gravity are within acceptable limits. Nothing you can't cope with. It's pretty damn hot down there, though.
It doesn't matter. It's not as if we had any choice in the matter. Description of landmasses, please.
Did you hear that? He said, please. I'm glad there's someone on this ship with a few manners. Landmasses. Just the one, stretching from pole to pole, with a handful of inland seas. Unusual. The landmass is covered with varying degrees of jungle. Life signs all over the place, big and small, but no indications of intelligent life. No starport, no cities, no gatherings of artificial structures. In fact, no structures at all that I can see. However, I do have a location for one structure in my memory files, courtesy of your father, Owen. Exact coordinates for the last standing of the original Deathstalker. However, I have to say I see nothing at all where it's supposed to be. I can only assume it's shielded in some way.
The last standing. This is where he came and made a stand against the Shadow Men. It's been a legend in my family for generations.
What happened when they finally met?
No one knows. None of them were ever seen again. Head for the coordinates, Oz. Put us down as close to it as you can.
The ship shook again, and then steadied itself.
That was the last remnants of the outer hull, Owen. All we've got left now is the basic shell. I've managed to steer us into a glide path that has steadied our descent, but unfortunately we now have a new problem.
Hit me with it.
I cannot continue to hold this ship together and pilot us in for a safe landing. The moment I release my hold on the ship's systems to computer landing, they'll fall apart so fast it'll make your head spin. But if I don't work out an exact plan for our landing, we're going to end up scattered over a hell of a lot of jungle. I'm open to suggestions, including prayer.
Owen realized everyone was looking at him and shook his head quickly.
Sorry, people. I just bought the ship. I haven't a clue on how to fly it. That's what I put Oz in for. Hazel, you're a pilot. Why don't you take over?
Because I'm not qualified to handle anything this complex. And in a situation like this, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Ruby?
The bounty hunter shook her head.
Same as you. You need an expert.
And I guess it's down to me, as always. I've flown everything else in my time. I don't see why this should be any different. So here I come again to save the day.
That won't be necessary. I'm a Hayden man. I have experience as a pilot, and I can interface directly with the ship's computers.
You haven't flown a ship in years, Random, and you are not what you used to be. Logically, I have to be the better bet.
I'm supposed to trust my life to a Haydenman who thinks he can talk to computers. Great. Wonderful. Why don't I just shoot myself now and get it over with?
Stop complaining or I'll help you. Moon, we're in your hands. The Haydenman nodded briefly, his face impassive. He closed his glowing golden eyes, and his breathing slowed until it was barely perceptible. Owen watched him closely. He was desperate to do something, but all he could do was watch and hope. The Haydenman's voice suddenly sounded through all their comm implants.
I'm patched into the flight computers through my implant. Hang on to something. The ride's about to get a bit bumpy.
The ship rolled sickly from one side to the other as the engines suddenly roared with new life and purpose. The lights flickered and grew dim, and a side door blew open. Flames burst into the lounge from the inferno in the next compartment. Owen threw himself aside, and the heat of the flames passing scorched his bare face and hands. Jack Random tried to close the door, but the heat drove him back. Hazel and Ruby Journey picked up the drinks cabinet between them and advanced on the flames, using it as a shield. They pushed back the flames, but couldn't let go of the cabinet long enough to make a grab for the door. Owen plunged forward, put his shoulder to the door, and slammed it shut. Hazel and Ruby wedged the cabinet against the door to keep it closed, and then all three collapsed on the shaking floor. Owen studied his hands carefully. They were red and smarting, but didn't seem to be actually burned. He'd been lucky. He looked up sharply as the roar of the engines faltered, and then cut out. The ship dropped like a stone. Owen's stomach lurched, and he looked round for something to grab onto. The sudden quiet was deafening, and the fall seemed to go on forever. And then the engines roared to life again, slowing the descent like a kick in the pants. The Sunstriders slowed and slowed, and then the engines cut out again, and Owen knew that was the last of their power. The ship crashed into the top of the jungle, smashing through the trees. The impact picked Owen up and threw him against the wall, and that was the last he knew of the landing. His head ached, but he could hear the crackle of flames nearby, and he knew that was important. He opened his eyes, wasted some breath on a few curses, and then forced himself back to his feet. The floor was steady again, though at something of an angle, but his legs weren't. He stamped his feet and shook his head to clear it. He'd be weak later when there was time. He looked around him, coughing painfully as the thickening smoke irritated his lungs. The fire in the next compartment had blown away the door and what was left of the drinks cabinet, and had taken a firm hold on one wall of the lounge. "Oz, talk to me. Status report." It was only quiet, and the rising roar of the flames. He heard someone coughing close at hand, and stumbled forward through the smoke, to find Hazel trying to drag a semi-conscious Ruby Journey toward the far door. He grabbed hold of Ruby's leathers, helped haul her over to the door, and kicked it open. There was only a flickering light in the corridor beyond it, but the air seemed clearer. "Head straight on, and you'll get to the main airlock. You get your friend out. I'll bring the others. Move it!" Hazel snarled something in return, but he'd already turned away. He raised his cloak up over his mouth and nose and plunged back into the smoke. It was already so thick he couldn't see more than a foot or so ahead of him. He found Jack Random by almost falling over him. The old rebel was crawling along the floor, down where the smoke was thinnest, but he'd lost all sense of direction. Owen helped him up and got him to the far door. He sent Jack after Hazel and Ruby, and then hesitated in the doorway. Tobias Moon was still in there, but Owen didn't know if he had it in him to go back into the smoke again. His lungs were aching, and his head was swimming. If he went back into the lounge again, there was a good chance he might not be able to make it out again. And Moon was a Hayden man after all, just as Owen was only an outlaw. He swore dispassionately and went back into the smoke. Finding the Hayden man was easier than finding the others. He was still where Owen had last seen him, sitting wedged in his corner. Owen tried to pick him up and was startled at the man's weight. He could barely move him. Augmentations, no doubt. He tried again, and still couldn't lift him. Owen struggled with the unmoving form and cursed it between coughs. Air was getting scarce, but he hadn't come this far to leave the Hayden man behind and run for the door. He boosted, and new strength flooded through his muscles. He pulled Moon to his feet, draped an arm over his shoulder, and headed to where he thought the far door was. The smoke was everywhere now, thick and smothering. It was like walking at the bottom of a great gray sea. He could feel the heat of flames on both sides of him. And then Hazel was suddenly there with him, adding her strength to his. And between them they got the Hayden men out the far door and down the narrow corridor beyond, and finally out into the clearer air of the main airlock. The door slammed shut behind them. Owen leaned back against it as he dropped out a boost, and the last of the strength went out of his legs. He dumped Moon unceremoniously on the floor and sat there beside him for a while, coughing foul stuff up out of his lungs. After a while, he felt strong enough to raise his head and look around, and wasn't surprised to find Hazel sitting next to him, looking almost as bad as he felt. Ruby Journey and Jack Random were sitting together, a little way apart. They had their guns in their hands, and although they both looked a bit pale, they were keeping a watchful eye on the outer hatch. Tobias Moon lay flat on his back, eyes closed, breathing steadily. Owen sniffed. "Nice landing, Moon. Sure you couldn't have shaken us about a bit more?" He stopped talking as he realized how harsh his voice sounded. His throat felt as though someone had scoured it with wire wool. Hazel looked at him sardonically.
We're down and we're still alive. Anything else is a bonus. Any idea why Moon is still out? He doesn't seem injured.
Beats me. I can't get any response out of ours, either. Maybe they were both knocked out when the computer systems finally crashed.
Actually, I'm conserving power. Moon pretty much drained the ship's batteries getting us down. I'm going to have to go offline for a while, Owen. The ship's a mess, and so am I. Short of a complete refit and rebuilding, the ship's not going anywhere, and neither are we. Unless you've fallen in love with this planet and decided to settle down here, you'd better pray that someone at the last standing is feeling hospitable.
How badly are you damaged?
Don't ask, you don't want to know. You're not far from the standing, about half a mile north-northwest. Walking distance under normal circumstances, which these aren't. In case you hadn't noticed, it's an oven out there, and it's just going to get hotter as the day goes on.
What about the air?
Your lungs are about to go slumming, but it won't kill you. There are a lot of other things out there that'll take care of that. For the moment, the local wildlife is giving you plenty of room, but there's no telling how long that'll last. I'm getting readings on life forms everywhere, from very small to extremely large and everything in between. Can't give you any details. The sensors took a real battering.
Any recommendations?
Yes. Shoot yourselves now and get it over with. From what I can make out, everything out there that moves is attacking everything else, whether it moves or not, and eating it. Damn place is a slaughterhouse. No signs of intelligence or cooperation, just if it moves, jump it. Reminds me of imperial politics on a larger-than-usual scale.
Nice place you've brought us to, Deathstalker.
Owen thought hard. There was only one course of action that made any sense, but he couldn't help hoping he could come up with something less obviously suicidal. Unfortunately, he seemed to have backed himself into a corner, tactically speaking. He looked round at his companions and wondered if his face was as grim as theirs. "We can't stay here. Sunstrutter is falling apart at the seams, and I think it would be in all our best interests to be a long way from here when it finally goes critical. Given the unfriendly and downright homicidal nature of the local wildlife, I think our best bet is to make a run for the last standing and hope we can find some sanctuary there."
Let me see if I've got this right. We're going to fight our way through half a mile of alien carnage and slaughter in order to reach some ruin that's been deserted for hundreds of years, if it's there at all. That's our plan?
Got it in one.
All right, I'm up for it. I could use a little exercise.
Owen gave her a hard look, but she didn't seem to be joking. It may not be all bad news. According to family legend, the last standing is supposed to be a massive structure with considerable technological defenses. Assuming we can get past those defenses, we should find my ancestor still there, held in stasis. If we can wake him, I'm sure he'll help.
There's a lot of ifs and maybes and all that. I don't have much faith in legends anymore. The last time we went looking for one, we found him.
She looked severely at Jack Random, who glared right back at her. Hazel sniffed and turned back to Owen.
Come on, Owen, what are our chances really?
Not good, but all the alternatives are worse.
I seem to be hearing that a lot just recently. Ever since I joined up with you, in fact. I should have stayed at home and become an accountant like Mother wanted. There's always work for an accountant, and people very rarely shoot at them. Or maroon them on savage planets with no table manners.
Oh, I don't know. I can think of quite a few accountants I'd have cheerfully dumped somewhere unpleasant. Right next to the lawyers. Owen looked across at Tobias Moon, who was still lying flat on his back, dead to the world. He'd better wake up soon, because I'm damned if I'm carrying a great lump like him through half a mile of homicidal jungle.
We could always use him as a shield. Or a battering ram.
If I didn't have such a good nature, I'd stay unconscious and let you carry me.
Eavesdroppers rarely hear well of themselves.
I believe that's the point.
Moon sat up slowly.
Everything seems to be functioning again. Hopefully we can find some energy crystals at the last standing. I used up most of my reserves getting us down in one piece. Not a bad landing, if I say so myself.
I'd hate to be on one of your bad ones.
You're alive, aren't you?
Enough chat and friendly banter. It's time we were moving. Oz, how long have we got before the Sunstrider goes into meltdown?
I should leave right now. I'm going to have to shut down, Owen. You'll have to struggle on without me. If you find compatible hardware at the standing, download me into that. Otherwise, you're on your own. Try not to get yourself killed.
I'll do my best. Owen wanted to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. Ozymandias had been with him since he was a child. He'd never had to cope without the AI before. I'll be back for you, Oz. One way or another, I'll be back.
If we've finished with the tender goodbyes, perhaps we can get a move on. You're the one who said the ship is going to blow.
Owen nodded curtly and moved over to the outer hatch. Oz, anything nasty out there? There was no reply. Owen bit his lower lip. He really was on his own now. He drew his gun and put his ear to the metal of the hatch. It was uncomfortably warm to the touch, suggesting the onboard fires were getting closer. He couldn't hear a thing. The metal was too thick. A passing investigator could have been slaughtering a brass band out there and he wouldn't have heard anything. He looked back at the others. Stand ready. Hazel, get over here by the manual release. When I give you the nod, open the hatch. Hazel moved over to the controls, and everyone drew a gun or a blade, according to their nature. They looked tired and tense, but prepared. Owen wished he'd had some armor and heavy-duty weaponry put on board at some point, but he'd never seen the need in a pleasure yacht. Assuming he got out of this mess alive and reasonably intact, it was a mistake he wouldn't make again. The universe was not a friendly place. He hefted the disruptor in his hand and looked back at the others. Everybody ready? Right. Remember, no rushing outside the moment the hatch opens. We're going to take this slow and steady and very carefully until we know the lay of the land.
Is he always like this?
Mostly. He used to be a lord. I think he inherited the pompousness along with the big ears.
Owen decided he hadn't heard that. Hazel, open the hatch. Bright crimson light spilled into the airlock, along with the heavy, humid air of the jungle. It smelled of rotting meat. And then, everything in the world tried to get through the hatch at once. They were huge, ferocious shapes with teeth and claws and glaring eyes, fighting each other for the chance to get in. There were smaller things that seemed to be all teeth and claws pouring over the lower edge of the airlock in waves. There were flying things and lashing tendrils of vegetation with vicious spines and barbs, and it all wanted to get in. There were screams and roars and ululating howls, echoing deafeningly in the confined space of the airlock. a long tentacled thing surged toward Owen, and he shot it automatically. The energy blast hit the beast at point-blank range, and its head exploded, showering him with foul-smelling blood. Something with huge clawed hands and a mouth bigger than Owen's head hauled the tentacled body out of the way and hurled itself at Owen. He met it with his sword, and more blood spurted as he cut deep into the leathery flesh. "Shut the hatch! Shut the bloody hatch!" Everyone was firing their guns at once, but the creatures kept coming, slavering in their eagerness to get at new prey. The airlock was full of awful life, and swords swung viciously. Hazel fought to get back to the control panels. A long tentacle whipped through the air, snatched up Moon, and hauled him bodily out the hatch and into the surging chaos outside. "Don't shut the hatch! They've got Moon! Somebody help him! Somebody else help him!" Random cut doggedly at a slimy creature that was apparently too stupid to know it should have been dead by now. "I've got my own problems." Hazel managed to hit the control button with her elbow, and the hatch began to close. The heavy steel weight moved remorselessly forward, cutting slowly but firmly through everything that got in its way. Gradually, the hatchway grew smaller, and the larger creatures were forced outside. The hatch finally slammed shut, and the remaining smaller creatures were trapped in the airlock. Owen and Random fought back-to-back, cutting down the vicious alien life as it struggled to get at them. Random fought well, Owen thought, for an old man. Hazel and Ruby were also fighting back-to-back and making a bloody mess of anything that came within reach. The horrors fell, one after the other, large and small, until finally it was over. Owen slowly lowered his sword and leaned against the bulkhead wall, panting for breath. It seemed very quiet in the airlock now, though the air was thick with the stench of blood and death. There were bodies everywhere, and blood dripped from every surface. Behind Owen, Random was coughing up something large and juicy. Hazel and Ruby were leaning on each other for support and glaring about them, swords still at the ready. "Moon! He's still out there."
Then he's dead. And so would we be, if we were stupid enough to go out after him.
Not necessarily. He is a Haydenman, after all.
They all looked up sharply as the sound of energy guns firing came dimly to them from somewhere close at hand.
Could the Empire have found us already?
It's not the Empire. Oz said we were alone down here. I think those are our guns, Sunstrider's guns. That's why we can hear them even with the hatch closed. But who's firing them? Your computer is supposed to be shut down. Have you been keeping something from us, Deathstalker? Oz, is that you? Owen waited, but there was no reply. The guns suddenly stopped firing, and it was very quiet in the airlock. I'm going to look outside.
Is this wise? After what happened the last time I opened the hatch?
The guns should have cleared some space around the ship.
And if they haven't?
I don't give a damn. Moon's out there. A Deathstalker doesn't abandon his people. He hit the hatch controls before anyone could raise further objections, and they all turned their guns on the opening hatch. Crimson light spilled into the airlock again, along with the charnel stench of the jungle. Even the light's the color of blood, thought Owen. What kind of place have I brought us to? Everyone braced themselves against another invasion of bloodthirsty creatures, but all was still and quiet. There were dead aliens everywhere, torn and tattered and piled up around the ship, but no signs of life or movement anywhere. The surrounding jungle was a mass of conflicting, vibrant colors, predominantly scarlet. The sky was mostly hidden by a thick canopy of branches overhead. There were huge, towering trees and gushing vegetable shapes everywhere, all spines and barbs and overripe flowers. And then something moved among the heaps of the dead, and Owen snapped his gun to bear before he recognized who it was. It was Moon, standing at the side of the ship, hip-deep in carnage, covered with alien blood, and looking inordinately pleased with himself. Owen jumped down from the airlock and made his way toward the Hayden man, clambering awkwardly over the heaps of bodies. The creatures ranged in size from gossamer insects the size of his hand to huge forms easily 20 feet long. None of them looked in very good shape. The ship's energy guns had torn them literally limb from limb. At such close range, they never stood a chance. But Owen couldn't bring himself to feel any sympathy. The smell was appalling, and he did his best to breathe through his mouth. He reached the Hayden man, and Moon nodded to him calmly.
About time I had a decent workout. I think I'm going to like it here.
All right. What the hell happened out here?
I tapped into the ship's systems through my comlink, overrode the computers, and took control of the fire systems. Then I had them blast everything that moved, while I sheltered among the bodies. Quite simple, really.
Owen looked at him. That shouldn't have been possible. Even with ours offline, the security code should have kept you out of the systems.
I overrode them. It wasn't difficult. I'm a Hayden man.
I didn't know you could do things like that.
There are lots of things about me you don't know.
Owen didn't have any answer to that, so he turned and gestured for the others to come and join him. They made slow progress through the heaps of the dead, keeping a constant wary eye on the surrounding jungle. Owen didn't blame them. He could feel the pressure of uncounted, unseen eyes following his every move. The ship's guns had taught the creatures caution, but there was no telling how long that would last.
What did you say this hellhole was called?
Chandrakor. Owen was still looking around him. This is where my ancestor fled when the Empire turned on him and sent the Shadow Men after him.
Who were they?
Said Random, still trying to get his breath back after clambering over the bodies. No one knows anymore. People apparently didn't talk about them much back then, if they knew what was good for them. The Shadow Men were the Emperor's hounds, unstoppable, quite deadly, and never once defeated. Basically pretty nasty and proud of it. They tracked my ancestor here to the very edge of the Empire, and then nothing more was heard of them, or him. No one ever came back from Chandrakor, no matter how large a force the Emperor sent. Eventually he turned his face away from the planet, and Chandrakor was not spoken of by anyone. Its coordinates became lost, its nature forgotten, and the name Chandrakor only survived as the battle cry of my clan. Even then we walked our own path. For a long time now, Chandrakor has been nothing but a legend, hidden away out here on the very edge of the rim. Forgotten by everyone, save obsessive historians like myself. We're about as far from the Empire now as you can get, without passing into the Dark Void.
Once I would have found that comforting, but not anymore. This is a vicious place you've brought us to, Deathstalker. Humans don't belong here.
I like it. It's got style.
We should head for the standing where things are still quiet. Do you have any force shields aboard, Owen? Just a portable screen. It's got enough range to cover us all while we walk, but as I recall, the power cells are pretty depleted.
You're just full of good news, aren't you? Will it last long enough for us to reach the standing?
Owen shrugged unhappily. Unknown. It's only half a mile, but who knows how long that'll take through this jungle. It might last, or it might cut out at any time. Moon smiled.
Good. More exercise.
Owen gave him a hard look. He had an unnerving feeling the Hayden man meant it. What with him and Ruby Journey, Owen was beginning to feel decidedly outclassed. He was also beginning to feel like the only sane person in the group. I'll get the screen, and then we'd better make a start. The ship is still going to explode eventually, and on top of that, we don't know how long the days are here. I have a strong feeling it would be a really bad idea for us to be lost in the jungle when darkness falls. I hate to think what kind of creatures go on the prowl during the night.
Maybe everything just goes to sleep?
Owen raised an eyebrow. Would you? The little light that did filter through the canopy was a dull brick red, as though the air itself was glowing from the rising heat of the day. Sweat poured off Owen as he cut a rough path through the close-set trees of the Chandrakor jungle. He could have just hung back and let the Hayden man do it. Moon didn't seem at all bothered by the heat, and his sword arm rose and fell as tirelessly as a machine. But Owen had his pride and insisted on taking his turn. He was beginning to feel like the weak link of the group. Everyone else was either an amazing fighter, a psychopath, or a legend, or any combination of the above. Owen was used to being the best there was. He'd been trained and raised to dominate any situation, to be the leader and inspiration of any group. But none of his aristocratic upbringing had prepared him for life as an outlaw on the run. So he ignored the heat and the sweat and his aching arm, and persevered, hacking a path through the thick vegetation with his sword, and tried not to think what that was doing to the blade's edge. Everyone else stayed close behind him. Ruby and Hazel carried their swords at the ready. Random had a gun in each hand, and the Hayden man brought up the rear, strolling coolly along as though this was nothing more than a pleasant walk in the park. Owen's mouth twitched grudgingly. For Moon, maybe it was. They all kept a careful eye on the surrounding jungle. They could hear things moving along with them, hidden from sight, keeping a respectful distance. The portable screen saw to that. It wasn't as powerful or impenetrable as a force shield, but its energy field established a perimeter around the group and administered a nasty shock to anything that tried to cross the line. The creatures learned quickly from the first few deaths, but still, every now and again, something would lurch suddenly forward from the dark between the trees to test the screen again. It happened just often enough to get on everyone's nerves and keep them jumpy, and their tempers were growing short. Innocent remarks took on insulting tones. With the result, they stopped talking to each other for anything but the absolutely necessary, which suited Owen just fine. He didn't have the breath or the inclination for conversation, and he had a lot to think about. There wasn't much about the original Deathstalker in the family archives. A great fighter and better statesman, warrior prime to the Empire, and inventor of the Dark Void device, the enigmatic machine that put out 1,000 suns in a moment, leaving their planets turning slowly in an unending night. The Dark Void, the darkness beyond the rim. The Deathstalker took the device and all his notes with him when he fled, and when it disappeared along with him, everyone breathed a quiet sigh of relief. Nobody wanted that threat hanging over their heads all the time. It would have made the Emperor altogether too powerful. But there had been nothing in the archives to suggest what kind of man the Deathstalker had been. Brave, certainly. Honorable, apparently. But what kind of man could have created a horror like the Dark Void device? And what happened to the friends, family, and supporters he'd left behind when he ran, left to the mercy of a furious emperor? There was no record of what had happened to them, but Owen thought he could make a damn good guess. So, assuming the Deathstalker was still held in stasis somewhere in the Last Standing, and assuming they could wake him, what would he be like? Would they be able to persuade him to join their rebellion against the Empire? An empire probably very different from the one he remembered. And if he still had the device, would they have the determination to use it again and cause the death of untold billions of innocents a second time? Owen attacked the vegetation before him with new anger. His head was aching, and it wasn't just from the heat. The jungle stretched away before him, thick and dense and unforgiving. He would have liked to use his disruptor to blast open a path, but he didn't want to risk starting a fire. There was no telling how easily the trees would burn, or which way a wind might carry that fire, and it would be a pretty nasty and stupid way to die. He didn't like the look of the trees. The trunks were 4 to 5 feet wide, with a dark red bark that was pitted and scarred. The branches stirred unsettlingly, even when there was no hint of a breeze, and the crimson leaves were long and narrow, with razor-sharp serrations. Everyone had quickly learned to keep their hands to themselves. The colors of the remaining vegetation were bright and primal, solid yellows and blues and pinks that clashed gaudily with the dominant scarlet. Either this planet hadn't discovered the benefits of camouflage or protective coloration, or it just didn't give a damn. Owen favored the latter explanation. Chandracore didn't strike him as a particularly subtle planet. Up above him, he could hear things moving in the higher branches, keeping up with his party, but so far none of them had come down to check out the new intruders in their territory. Didn't stop them emptying their bowels all over the group, though. Owen was just grateful the screen protected their heads as well as their sides. Something huge howled in agony as it was brought down by something even bigger not too far away. The ground shuddered under its weight, and he looked quickly about him. The forescreen would keep out most things, but he didn't know for sure whether it could stand up to something really large just dropping on it with all its weight. The screen might just overload and collapse. Great, thought Owen. Something else to worry about. The creatures were definitely edging closer again. Either they were getting over their fear of the screen and the guns, or they just didn't care.
Take a break,
Hazel said behind him, and Owen gratefully came to a halt. He wiped the sweat from his face with his sleeve and looked back at the rest of his party. Hazel looked almost as shattered as he felt. Ruby Journey was breathing hard, but her back was still straight and her head erect. Jack Random had taken the opportunity to sit down, ignoring the insects swarming around him. He sat with his shoulders slumped and his head hanging down, and sweat dripped from his face onto the ground. Moon looked perfectly calm and collected, as though he could walk for miles yet. Owen hated him on general principles. Something large and blocky leapt out of the trees at them, then howled angrily as it hit the screen. It struggled against the energy field for a long moment, ignoring the shocks, but finally fell back, defeated. Owen couldn't help noticing that it was taking longer all the time for the screen to have an effect. Either the field was weakening, or the creatures were getting stronger and more determined. Owen knew which was the most likely, but he was too tired to care. He sat down, and after a moment, Hazel and Ruby joined him. Have you ever seen anything like this before, Hazel?
There's a couple of cities on Loki that are almost as dangerous to walk through, but no. I've never come across anything as unrelentingly lethal as this. I mean, don't they ever stop eating? You'd think they'd run out of prey at this rate. Surely they must stop sometime, if only to sleep and digest.
Maybe they're working shifts. Hazel managed a small smile.
You're the one with the built-in compass. How much further to the standing?
At least a quarter of a mile. We're barely halfway there.
Oh, is that all?
Hazel shook her head wearily.
Seems like I've been slogging through this jungle forever. Any more bad news you'd like to share with me?
We're draining the crystals in our guns. The screen isn't holding up as well as I'd hoped, and it's getting hotter. I don't think we've even reached midday yet. I hate this place.
Oh, good. Something more to worry about. I don't know why I ever saved you, Deathstalker. You're a bloody jinx to be around, you know that?
Yes, I do. You keep telling me. You should be grateful to me for bringing a little adventure into your life. Would you rather be stuck in an office all day, staring into a monitor screen?
Frankly, yes.
Come on, we'd better start moving again. Owen tried to force some confidence into his voice. Only a quarter of a mile to go. Wait a bit longer. If we wear ourselves out too quickly, we'll never get there. We have to pace ourselves. Owen looked at Random, surprised. The old rebel sounded much fresher and stronger than he had. Random saw the look and grinned easily. I've done this before, lad. Couldn't tell you how many jungles on how many planets I've hacked my way through in my time. You have to learn to spread your strength, so it's there to be called on when you need it. Don't worry about the screen and the guns. Either they'll hold out or they won't, and either way there's nothing you can do about it. Save your energy for problems you can solve, like making sure the path you're cutting is as straight as you can get it. Even a mild curve could pull us miles off course. I'm watching the compass. We're dead on course. Listen, if you've got any other wisdom to offer, don't be shy about sharing it. I'm new to all this, and I'll take all the help I can get. Good attitude for a leader. You're doing fine, Deathstalker. Lead from the front, and we'll follow.
Speak for yourself. I wouldn't trust that inbred aristo to lead sheep to slaughter.
Interesting choice of phrase, my dear. Perhaps you'd care to modify it, given our current position?
No, I wouldn't, and I'm not your dear.
That's for sure. You've never been anybody's dear.
I've never been anybody's fool, either.
Ruby glared at them all impartially.
I should never have let you talk me into this. I could have made a perfectly good fortune just handing you over to the authorities. Instead, I'm stuck in the middle of a bloody jungle. Light years from anywhere halfway civilized, with no provisions and no bloody ship. I should have shot you all on sight.
You did try.
You wouldn't shoot me, Ruby. I'm your friend.
Ruby looked at her.
The rewards on all your heads would buy me a lot of friends.
Not the kind that matter. It's a lonely place, this empire, without friends to watch your back.
Friends are a luxury, like faith, politics, and family. They always let you down in the end. The only person you can ever really trust is yourself. I'd have thought you'd have known that after all the times you got your ass kicked by the Empire. Your great rebellion is over, Random.
It's not over till I say it's over. As long as I refuse to give up, they haven't beat me. The strength of rebellion lies in the heart, not in armies.
Nice sentiment. I'm sure they'll put it on your tombstone.
Thank you, Ruby. That's very good of you. Time to get moving again, Deathstalker. If we've got the energy to argue, we're rested enough to start up again.
He rose easily to his feet, looking calm and relaxed and ready to go. Owen was surprised to find he'd gotten his second wind while they were talking, and got to his feet with only minor winces. He put out a hand to Hazel, who ignored it and got up unaided. Owen didn't even try to offer his hand to Ruby. The bounty hunter rose up as lively and effortlessly as she'd sat down, her face cold and calm and untouched by any trace of passion. Owen smiled, hefted his sword thoughtfully, and turned back to the vegetation blocking his trail. If he had to be stranded on an unfriendly world, he was glad he was accompanied by fighters, not quitters. He was especially pleased to see Jack Random coming to life again. This was more like the legendary rebel he'd heard so much about. Ruby moved up alongside to help. Owen wasn't too happy about having the bounty hunter that close to him with a naked blade in her hands. She made him nervous. He kept a watchful eye on her until she decided they'd made enough ground, then dropped back to walk with the others. Owen breathed a little more easily, though his back still prickled just a little. After a moment, Hazel moved up beside him.
What's the problem between you and Ruby?
Don't know what you mean.
Come off it. I saw you shooting suspicious looks at her, in what you obviously thought was an unobtrusive manner. Don't you trust her?
Of course not. She's a bounty hunter, and I'm bounty.
We're all outlaws together now, Aristo.
Some of us are more outlaws than others.
She's my friend. She gave me her word. You can trust her as you trust me.
Exactly. Hazel had to think about that for a moment, and then glared at him and fell back to join the others, scowling heavily. Owen sighed and took out his spleen on the helpless vegetation before him. It didn't help much. He liked Hazel. He admired her courage and her forthright manner, but they couldn't seem to exchange two words without arguing. Jack Random came forward to walk at his side, and they cut trail together in silence for a while. The only sound, the solid chunk of steel cutting through vegetation. A word of advice. Never win an argument with a woman. They'll forgive anything but that. But I was right. What's that got to do with anything? We're making good time. Would you like to take over the lead for a while? No, thanks. In my experience, the point man is the most dangerous job. You're welcome to it. You should be leading this party anyway. I mean, you're Jack Random. I used to be, and given time I might be again. But for the moment, I'm just a tired old man pulled out of retirement for one last fight. I've got a long way to go before I'm competent to lead anything but a suicide charge. You carry on, lad. You're doing a good job as leader. Am I? Hazel and I spit at each other like cats. Moon worries the hell out of me, and I daren't turn my back on Ruby. And you're holding them all together. You give them purpose and point them in the right direction. That's all anyone really has the right to expect of a leader. I should know. He grinned easily at Owen, clapped him once on the shoulder, and dropped back to the others. Owen wiped the sweat from his face with his sleeve and stood a little straighter. If Jack Random said he was doing a good job, he must be. He was still getting used to the idea when Moon appeared suddenly at his side. I have a question for you, Deathstalker. How are you going to get me to Hayden when you don't have a ship anymore? You said you'd get me there. You gave me your word. I'll get you there. How? I'm working on it. Moon nodded and fell back to join the others, leaving Owen by himself. He growled, not completely under his breath, and hacked at a web of hanging creepers. He felt he could use a little time to himself. For some reason, the creatures surrounding the party seemed to be showing them a lot more respect. Owen found that suspicious, but he could live with that. Sometime later, the jungle fell suddenly away before them, to reveal a large clearing with a huge stone castle in its center. Owen raised an arm to protect his eyes from the direct glare of the sun. The heat was almost blistering away from the protection of the jungle canopy, but he held his ground. He'd come a long way to be here, and besides, it felt good not to have to worry about which direction an attack might come from next. The creatures of the jungle were always there, close at hand, watching and following. Owen's back ached from the constant tension and anticipation of an attack. He lowered his sword and leaned on it gratefully as he studied the castle in the clearing. It was a huge structure, rising up high enough to hide the jungle behind it, and composed of uncomfortably large blocks of dull gray stone. There were tall, thin towers with pointed roofs and crenellated battlements. There was no sign of any activity or any light at any of the small slit windows, and the single great door was closed. And on top of all that, the whole castle seemed slightly out of focus, seen through the faint shimmer of the force shield that surrounded it. For a long time, nobody said anything. Owen looked up at the sky. The sun was blood red and sinking down toward the tops of the trees. Not long now till night, and whatever new creatures prowled in it.
So that's the last standing of your ancestor, Owen. I'm impressed. How the hell did he manage to build something like that on a planet like this?
It wasn't exactly what I was expecting. He must have had help of some kind.
Right. In case you hadn't noticed, the boundaries of this clearing are extremely distinct, which suggests it was probably cut using energy weapons. Still doesn't explain where he found all that stone, though. Must have a quarry somewhere. Then who worked in it?
They stared at the castle in silence for a while. The force shield's another complication I wasn't expecting. The only way to lower a shield like that is from the inside, and we've no guarantee there's any living soul left in there. Since the shield's still up, I think we can safely assume there's some degree of automation. Computers running things on a low-priority basis.
Must have an amazing power source in there, to be still running things after all these years.
Unless somebody else got here first.
They all considered that.
The beasts of the jungle acted like they'd encountered energy weapons before, and they stopped bothering us the closer we got to the castle in the clearing. If the Empire got here first,
then we're in real trouble. Nothing could beat my ship here.
Only one way to find out.
And Ruby stepped out into the clearing, gun in one hand, sword in the other. 2 bright glows appeared in windows on either side of the great door. Hazel threw herself at Ruby and knocked her to the ground, and 2 disruptor beams flashed through the air where she'd been standing and incinerated the trees behind her. They burned fiercely for a moment, and then the flames died down and flickered out. The charred wood smoked gently.
Tough trees.
Like everything else on this planet. You girls all right?
We are not girls.
That's for sure.
Hazel dragged Ruby back into the shelter of the trees and helped her to her feet. Ruby didn't even nod her thanks, her cold eyes fixed on the castle. The 2 glows on either side of the door were still there. Ruby raised her gun and then lowered it again. Top of the line force shield. That's energy beams out without having to drop the field first. Must use a hell of a lot of power to cover something that large. Certainly we haven't got any weapon that'll bother it.
I think we can safely assume that whoever's in there, they're not feeling friendly.
Hazel brushed grass and insects from her clothes.
I don't know. Those had the feel of warning shots. A computerized defense system would have tracked you no matter how fast you moved, and kept on firing till it was sure its target had been eliminated.
So what do we do next? Apart from suicide tactics.
She glared at Ruby, who was still ignoring her.
Communicate. People or machines, they might respond to contact.
It might also give them something to aim their guns at.
She has a point.
We can't just stand around here. In case you've forgotten, we've nowhere else to go except the castle. Either we find a way in, or we live in the jungle, which doesn't exactly appeal to me. I'm going to go out there unarmed and talk to them. If those are my ancestors' computers, they might react to me. I am a Deathstalker, after all.
You go right ahead. Personally, I'm going to find something large to hide behind.
Owen smiled and couldn't help noticing she didn't make a move as he stepped cautiously out into the clearing. He put away his gun and his sword and held up his hands to show they were empty. He cleared his throat carefully. He didn't want to be misunderstood. I am Owen, first of Clan Deathstalker. I come to you in need and danger, and call upon you for sanctuary. I bear my family's ring. He held the hand forward so that the castle sensors could get a clear look at it. Sweat was running down his face again, and it wasn't from the blazing heat of the open clearing. A light appeared in another window, and he had to fight not to flinch. And then, all the lights went out, and the force shield snapped off just in front of the door, leaving a clear tunnel open in the shield. Owen blinked and looked back at the others. I think that's an invitation. Let's move it before they change their minds. And people, put away your weapons. The rest of the party emerged cautiously from the edge of the jungle and took in the break in the force shield as they reluctantly sheathed their weapons. That is not possible. You can't just lower part of a force shield like that. The field would collapse.
Impossible or not, it's there. May I suggest we use it before it disappears and leaves us stranded here?
Of course. After you.
Oh, it's your family and your castle. After you.
Owen smiled briefly and walked out into the clearing. He could feel the presence of the force shield on either side of him, so close he could have reached out his arms and touched it. Little runs of static moved in his clothes and sparked in his hair. He took a deep breath and kept walking. He could hear the others moving close behind him, but he didn't turn to look. It might make him appear nervous, and he had a feeling this would be a bad time to appear to be weak. The castle grew bigger the closer he got to it, until it was looming over him like a mountain. The sheer scale of the place and the massive size of the stone blocks made his head ache. He couldn't imagine the army of people and technology it must have taken to build the last standing, starting from scratch on a new planet. There were still no lights at any of the windows, no sign of life. He still had the feeling he was being watched. He finally came to a halt before the only door and stared at it thoughtfully. 10 feet tall, 6 feet wide, solid wood studded with some kind of crimson metal, like drops of blood. A disruptor would probably tear right through it, but it looked like it would stop anything else. The others crowded in around him.
What do we do now?
Knock, very politely. We may have to. There's no handle or any sensor that I can see. Probably doesn't get many visitors out here.
I don't want to worry anyone, but the force field has reestablished itself behind us. We're trapped.
For someone who didn't want to worry us, I'd say you've managed very well.
I could break the door down.
Thanks for the thought, but no. The last thing we want to do right now is make a bad impression. Those energy guns are probably still trained on us, and I don't want whoever's behind them feeling nervous. If you want to be useful, Moon, try talking to the castle. If there are computers inside the standing, you might be able to communicate with them. Moon nodded and frowned slightly, concentrating. In that moment, much of the humanity went out of the Hayden man's face, dominated by the blazing golden eyes, and Owen fought down a sudden impulse to shiver. Moon's face cleared, and he looked at Owen.
Nothing. If there are any computers in there, either they're not listening or they're not talking.
Show your ring to the sensors again. That got a response last time.
Owen lifted his hand and showed it a little self-consciously to the windows above the door. No light showed, and he'd started to lower his hand again, when suddenly he was somewhere else. There was no warning or sense of transition. One moment he was standing before the door, and the next he was in a great hall, presumably inside the standing. It stretched away before him, incredibly long and wide, and completely deserted. An army could have drilled in the hall, or a full clan gathering could have danced in it, but there was no sign of any life, save for the lights shining overhead. There was no fire in the great marble fireplace, but the floor had been recently waxed and polished, and there was no trace of dust anywhere. The others were suddenly in the hall with him, looking almost as confused as he felt.
What the hell just happened?
Hazel dropped one hand to the gun at her side. Transfer portal. I've heard about them, but never expected to encounter a working one. They were created centuries ago. Instant teleportation between two places to save the aristocracy the bother of actually having to travel from one place to another. They never caught on because of the massive amounts of power involved, and because they were a security nightmare. Then Espers came in and replaced them. No power sources required, and a damn sight cheaper to run. The Empire's always had a fondness for slave labor over machinery. This place must have a hell of a power source hidden away somewhere, if it can still operate a transfer portal after all this time.
940 years. Whoever built this standing built it to last.
I've just had a really nasty thought. If this place is being run by computers, could it have been taken over by the AIs from Shub? They're supposed to have all kinds of technology that we don't.
You're right. That is a nasty thought. If you have any more like that, feel free to keep them to yourself. Things are tricky enough as it is without us getting paranoid. We're a long way from Shub, and the last I heard, the enemies of humanity were safely tucked away behind an Imperial blockade. Let's all please concentrate on the matter at hand.
You got us in here, Deathstalker. What say you lead us to this ancestor of yours? I've got a few questions I wouldn't mind putting to him.
All right. Owen tried hard to sound confident. Follow me. He strode off down the great hall, the echoes of his footsteps sounding loud and flat in the silence. The others moved quickly after him, not wanting to be left behind, trying very hard to look casual and unimpressed. Owen allowed his hand to rest quietly near his gun. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting to find at his ancestor's legendary last standing, but this wasn't it. This immense castle wasn't the last refuge of a desperate man, driven and harried to a planet light years from civilization. This was a power base, designed for survival against overwhelming odds, a place to strike back from. But he never had. He had all this power at his command, but instead he chose to hide himself away in stasis, waiting for an awakening that never came. Owen frowned. Presumably the Empire had been just as overwhelming an enemy then as it was now, but Owen had a strong feeling he didn't have anything like the whole story. He strode on, trying to look confident and unthreatening at the same time. He was pretty damn sure the standing had just as many security measures inside as it did outside. He reached the other end of the hall without incident, stepped through the open door, and found himself somewhere else, completely unconnected to the hall. He just passed through another transfer portal. It didn't take Owen and the rest of his party long to discover two important things about the portals. One, every door in the castle was a portal leading somewhere unexpected, and two, you couldn't go back through the door to wherever you'd just come from. And so the party jumped blindly from room to room, passing ever deeper into the depths of the last standing. Owen kept himself oriented with his internal compass, but he had no way of knowing exactly where in the castle he was at any given time, or how to get out of it. All the rooms were perfectly clean and brightly lit, but with nothing to show they had ever been lived in. Owen became increasingly convinced that they were being watched at all times, but couldn't spot anything that might have been a sensor. Whoever was controlling the portals apparently had some destination in mind, but where and why remained a mystery. Owen kept walking and tried very hard to be patient. He had a strong suspicion that even if he had felt like being awkward, it wouldn't have made any difference. He was in someone else's hands now, for better or worse. He tried to keep his hand near his gun without being too obvious about it. They passed through room after room, all of them devoid of interest or personality. No fixtures or fittings, no comforts of any kind. Owen became increasingly convinced that no one had ever lived in the castle. Until finally they came to what Owen immediately thought of as a trophy room. Unlike the other rooms, this one was of a more comfortable size, though its contents were anything but comforting. A large glass case took up the center of the room, some 10 feet square, and in that case, like trophies on display, stood 3 men in outdated battle armor. They were so still that Owen first thought they were models of some kind, but when he moved forward and pressed his nose against the glass, he quickly became convinced they were real. Their poses were stiff, their faces were blank, and there were bloody holes in their armor.
They're dead, aren't they? I thought at first they were in stasis, but there's no trace of any equipment.
They're preserved in some way. I'd kill for a closer look at them.
No problem.
Owen whirled around, gun in hand, every muscle tensed, for an attack that never came. He slowly relaxed and turned back to the Hayden man.
Moon, if I wanted a heart attack, I'd play Russian roulette with a fully charged disruptor. Don't do anything else without checking with me first. You could have set off some kind of security system.
We need information.
Moon seemed entirely unfazed by the anger in Owen's voice. He stepped through the wreckage of the glass wall, splinters crunching under his boots, and studied the figures closely. Randa moved in quickly after him, followed by Hazel and Ruby. Owen decided he wasn't doing any good just standing outside on his own, shook his head resignedly, and entered the glass case himself. Up close, the 3 figures looked even more disturbing. Moon prodded one with his finger, and it rocked gently on its feet.
What the hell are they?
Hazel seemed afraid they might hear her.
It's not stasis, whatever it is.
They're preserved. They died violently, according to the evidence, and then their insides were removed, and some kind of preservative material was pumped inside them.
How can you tell?
I can smell the chemicals, and there are telltale signs in the skin if you know what to look for.
Owen decided not to ask how the Hayden men knew which signs to look for. He didn't think he really wanted to know.
Who do you suppose they were?
According to the family histories, my ancestor, the original Deathstalker, was pursued here by 3 of the greatest mercenary assassins of their time, the infamous Shadow Men. They were never heard of again. Apparently they did catch up with their prey after all.
You mean he killed them and then had them preserved and mounted as trophies? Nasty sense of humor your ancestor had, Owen. Or was this usual for the time?
No, it wasn't. They left the shattered case and moved on, heading still deeper into the standing. They all had a gun or a sword in their hands now. It was like walking through a gigantic trap, waiting for the punchline. They stepped into the next portal and vanished. Owen stepped out of the transfer portal and found himself in a world of ice. 3 inches of snow covered the floor. Long icicles hung down from the high ceiling, and thick hoarfrost made whorled patterns on the walls. It was bitterly cold, and Owen shuddered convulsively. He pulled his cloak tightly about him, folded his arms across his chest, and watched his breath steam on the air as he tried to stop shivering. The others appeared behind him, and they all huddled together for warmth. Except Moon, who didn't seem at all bothered. Owen's thoughts slowly returned to him, having been driven aside for a moment by the sudden shock of the cold, and he looked about him. The air was crisp and sharp, with only a slight haze of mist. The room wasn't all that large compared to some of the rooms he'd walked through to get here, but it gave the impression of great size, as though the walls were not strong enough to contain everything the room held. In the middle of the room,
a bright shimmering light shone from the floor to the ceiling, a silver pillar of illumination. And in that pillar was a man, standing unnaturally still, held in the light like a butterfly transfixed on a pin. Owen walked slowly forward, impelled by an impulse that was half curiosity and half awe. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, and he realized he was the first person to break the surface of the snow since it had first fallen, some 900 years earlier. He felt in a strange way as though he had stepped back in time when he entered this room, stepped into an earlier age when the Empire was still fresh and new, the product of great men and women, carved from the unfeeling emptiness of space with courage and audacity. There were heroes and villains in those days, when events were larger than life, and everything had the stamp of greatness. Giants walked the stage of Empire then, and this was one of them. Owen stopped just short of the silver pillar and studied the man within. He was as tall as Owen, but sparsely built, though his arms were curved with muscle. He looked to be in his early 50s, with a solid, lined face, a silver-gray goatee, and long gray hair held back in a scalp lock. He wore a set of battered and shapeless furs, held in at the waist with a wide leather belt. His leather boots were starting to come apart at the stitching. He wore thick golden armlets and heavy metal rings on his fingers. He carried a long sword in a leather scabbard hanging down his back, and a gun of unfamiliar design hung on his hip. Overall, he gave an impression of strength at rest, and with his eyes closed, he looked only as though he was thinking for a moment, and might at any time open his eyes and look around.
So that's him.
Owen jumped despite himself. He hadn't heard her move up alongside him. The others gathered around the silver pillar of light, giving it plenty of room just in case. They seemed impressed by the room, if not the man. Owen found himself thinking of an insect caught in amber. This is him. Owen was careful to keep his voice calm and even. The Deathstalker. The original Deathstalker, founder of my clan. We still sing songs about his valor and his exploits, though the Empire banned them long ago. He's been here over 900 years, waiting for someone to come for him. Waiting, while the wheel turned and the Empire moved on without him.
He doesn't look like much. I could take him.
Are we really going to wake him? He's been asleep a long time, and things have changed. He might find it very difficult to adapt. He was a warrior, and some things haven't changed at all. Family, loyalty, betrayal. I think he'll fit in quite well. Besides, we need him. Owen stepped forward and thrust his hand bearing his father's ring into the shimmering silver column. The light blazed up blindingly, and Owen had to turn his head away. He tried to fall back from it, but his hand was held firmly in the light. A slow rumble of power filled the chamber, as though ancient engines were awakening to life again. The floor shook, and icicles broke off from the ceiling, plunging down like swords. Then, the silver light snapped off, gone so suddenly it was as though it had never been there. Owen looked back at his ancestor, standing there before him. The man's chest rose and fell slowly, and then he lifted his head and opened his eyes. They were a surprisingly mild gray, but his gaze was firm and direct. He studied Owen for a moment, and then shook his head.
I don't know you, but you bear my ring. Are you family, boy?
Yes, sir. I am Owen Deathstalker, your descendant. I am first of the clan, though the present Empress has tried to strip that from me and declared me outlaw. I need your help, kinsman. The Empire has turned on me, as it did on you. It is time to take up the sword again.
Maybe. How long have I slept?
943 years, kinsman.
Oh, things changed much since my day.
Surprisingly little, kinsman. The essentials are still the same. I've studied the Empire's past. I'm a historian. The older man gave Owen a hard look.
What kind of occupation is that for a Deathstalker? What campaigns have you fought in? How many wars?
None, actually. I'm not really the warrior type. The Deathstalker shook his head slowly.
I've been gone too long. The blood's grown thin. Let's get out of here, boy. Too damn cold here for my liking. Reminds me of the grave. And call me Giles. It was my name long before I gave my clan the name Deathstalker.
He headed for the door, giving the others just enough time to get out of the way. Owen hurried after him, and the others scrambled to keep up with him.
Historian. Tell me, how much has science advanced in my absence? Are you still using disruptors?
Yes, sir. The Empire has kept a careful control on science and progress down the centuries. This helps to keep things stable and reserves what advances are made for the ruling classes. Just another way to keep power. We still use disruptors. Recharge is down to 2 minutes now.
I suppose that's an improvement. Energy guns, flashy things. Powerful, but limited. Projectile weapons are much more versatile, but they were already being phased out of the Empire when I had to leave in a hurry. The aristocracy wanted them stamped out. Too easy to make, too easy to use, and far too much power to be left in the hands of the lower classes. Energy weapons are difficult to make, and very expensive. So they replaced projectile guns, and the only effective weapons end up the property of the ruling classes and their enforcers. Good thinking. But I never believed in it, so I never went along with it. Which is at least partly why I ended up here.
He stopped before the portal, snapped,
"Armory!"
and then stepped through and vanished. Owen looked at the others. Well, what do you think? Do we follow him?
He's your ancestor. Can we trust him?
I don't know. He's not what I expected. Put it this way, what other choice do we have? We can't even find our way out of this place without him. Randon stepped through the transfer portal, and the others followed him. There was the usual sudden shift from one view to another, and then Owen stopped dead in his tracks and looked about him. He was in another great hall, stretching away before him for as far as he could see, but here the walls were covered with more kinds of weapons than he'd ever seen in his life. There were handguns and rifles of all shapes and sizes, including several it would have taken 2 men to carry. None of them looked to be energy guns.
What the hell are they?
Projectile weapons. I've seen some of these in the older archive records. They were effective and efficient, but no damn use at all against force shields. They were also no match for the range and accuracy of energy guns. That's why the old style of weapon was replaced by the new, officially.
Shot for shot, they were right. A disruptor can outperform any projectile weapon. But on the other hand, they don't have to stop and recharge between shots for 2 minutes. You can fire over and over again, as long as your ammunition holds out. You'll be surprised how much damage you can do when you're firing 1,000 rounds a second. I have a gun here for every occasion, small and large. There are weapons here that can assassinate a single man in a crowd from up to 2 miles away, and others that could take out a whole town.
Unless they have force shields. Giles grinned at him.
That's better, boy. At least you can think like a warrior. Force shields are fine, but they also have a built-in limitation. They only last as long as their energy crystals hold out. Once they've been drained by constant use, it takes forever to recharge them. So all you have to do is maintain a steady stream of fire, wait for the shields to go down, and then charge right in.
He gestured grandly at the others.
Take a look around. See if there's something here that takes your fancy. You stay with me, boy.
He waited for the others to move away, and then turned to Owen and lowered his voice.
Fill me in. How big is your army? How many men am I going to have to supply guns for?
Owen looked at him blankly for a moment. I don't Actually have an army, sir. There's just myself and my associates here. Our ship crashed not far from here. It's a wreck. We're all there is, sir. Giles pursed his lips and nodded slowly.
Deathstalker luck. Always bad. Fortunately for you, boy, I have a ship. How big a force have you got on your tail? I assume the Empire was right behind you when you jumped to come here?
Yes, sir. 2 Imperial Star Cruisers. Giles looked at him with a certain amount of respect for the first time.
Well, now that's more like it. Don't worry, we'll be gone long before they can get here. Tell me about your friends. Are they good fighters, reliable?
The best. Hazel Dark's a pirate and clone legger, Ruby Journey's a bounty hunter, Jack Random's a professional rebel, and the disturbing-looking one is Tobias Moon. He is an augmented man.
A cyborg? They were still trying to make that work when I left. Is he any good in a fight?
Owen grinned. Moon kicks ass. Anybody's ass. But I wouldn't turn your back on him too often. Augmented men often have their own agendas. And all of my people are good fighters.
Can I depend on them? Will they follow orders?
Maybe. After all, they're outlaws like me. And like you. Convince them that it's in their best interests to work with you, and they will. But don't just give them orders and expect them to snap to attention. They don't have much love or respect for authority in general, and aristos in particular. But they're good people. Mostly.
And what about you, Owen Deathstalker, the historian? Can you fight?
I do all right. I've been trained by the best, and I have the boost. I can take care of myself.
The boost? That's another thing they were trying to make work when I left. You're full of surprises, kinsman. Unfortunately, I now have one for you. According to my computers, an Imperial starship has just dropped into orbit around Chandrakor. The standings shielded from their sensors unless they've radically improved since my day, but your wrecked ship isn't. It won't take them long to spot it and send some heavily armed people down to check for survivors. I've downloaded your AI into my systems. Pretty sophisticated, but not half as smart as it thinks it is.
Oz, are you there?
Where else would I be? You should see the antiquated system they've dumped me in. Wouldn't surprise me if this junk ran on steam power. Give me a week or two and I'll be running things around here.
Behave yourself. We're guests here. We'll talk later. For now, keep your eyes and ears open and make yourself useful.
Got it.
Owen looked at Giles. He's been with me a long time. He's a pain in the ass, but he's good at what he does.
I heard that.
Shut up, Oz.
Tell me, Owen, why did you come here looking for me?
My only hope for survival is to mount a rebellion against the Empress. And for that, I need the Dark Void device. With Giles's eyes boring into his, it never even occurred to Owen to lie. Do you still have it?
No, but I know where it is. I only ever used it once, and 1,000 stars blinked out in a moment, leaving nothing but darkness. The Dark Void. Thousands of inhabited planets were left without suns. Billions upon billions of people died. That's a lot of ghosts for one man to live with. I'd done many questionable things in my time as Warrior Prime, and come to terms with them. But that was too much, even for me. I'd sworn an oath to protect and preserve the Empire, not destroy it piece by piece for the pleasure of others. I created the device almost by accident, while working on something else. I was the only one who could operate it. That made it my responsibility. So I did the only responsible thing left to me. I took the device and ran. Hid myself here, where no one would ever find me, except family. And just as a safeguard, I stashed the device somewhere else. I left it in the heart of the Madness Maze, on the cold corpse of the Wolfling world, deep in the Dark Void.
Owen looked at him for a long moment, searching for something to say. The wolf
Wolflings were a part of legend, the first genetically engineered human beings. They were supposed to be living killing machines, the perfect soldiers, but unfortunately the Empire did its work too well. The Wolflings were unbeatable. The Empire grew scared of what it had created and wiped out the Wolflings while they were still trapped on their planet. It was lost to history when it became part of the Dark Void. No wonder no one had ever found the device if it was hidden there. Few ships had ever crossed the rim into the Dark Void and come back to tell of it. We need the device. Our rebellion hasn't a hope in hell without it. Giles looked at him steadily.
And is your rebellion really so important?
You've been asleep a long time.
Hazel was suddenly there beside them.
You don't know how bad things have got. If you're rich or an aristo or connected, you can have anything, do anything, and no one can stop you. You can destroy lives, and no one can make you pay.
They use and discard us, and no one cares.
I fought the Empire all my adult life. Fought and bled on 100 worlds, only to see my war for truth and justice come to nothing. They have the ships and the weapons and the armies, and all we have is right on our side. It's not enough.
Giles looked at Ruby Journey. She was standing quietly at the back, arms folded. She looked bored.
What about you, Bounty Hunter? Don't you have anything to say to me? No appeals to my better nature?
Ruby looked at him calmly.
I made a good living hunting down the Empire's enemies. Outlaws. Now I am one. Funny how things change.
What's changed you?
Ruby smiled.
Hazel's my friend. She hasn't the sense to come in out of the rain, but sometimes the rain follows you no matter where you go. The Empire wants her dead, I want her alive. So to hell with the Empire. Besides, I was promised as much loot as I can carry if we win, and you'd be surprised how much I can carry when I put my mind to it.
Hazel smiled at her.
Ruby, I never knew you cared so much.
Don't get cocky. If the reward on you had been just a little higher, things might have turned out differently.
Giles turned back to Owen.
If I led you to the device, what would you do with it? It's not exactly a subtle weapon. You could use it to destroy whatever planet the Empress is currently using as a home world, but only by destroying 1,000 other worlds with it. Could you do that? Create another Dark Void in the heart of the Empire?
You used it.
And look what it did to me. I thought I had good reason. I was wrong. What about you, kinsman? What price will you pay to win?
I don't know. I've seen enough killing already, and none of it for a good enough reason. The young girl lay crying in the bloody Mistworld snow, her legs crippled forever by his blade. Perhaps all I really want is to see the device destroyed before the Empress can get her hands on it. She wouldn't hesitate to use it. I don't know, Giles. I can't make a decision like this. I'm just a historian, a hoarder of old books and records, not a warrior or a revolutionary. Ask Jack or Hazel. Ask anyone but me.
That's what I said. But in the end, I did what I thought I had to. And so will you when your time comes. I'll take you to the device. And let us all pray we get there before the Empire does.
You have a ship?
Oh, yes, I have a ship.
How long will it take to power it up? It's got to be in one hell of a state after spending so many centuries in mothballs.
My computers began bringing it back to life the moment I awakened. I always knew I might have to leave in a hurry.
Better be a fast ship. Got a lot of determined people on our trail, most especially including the one in orbit.
And I must beg passage of you.
Giles looked at the augmented man interestedly.
My people were created on the lost world of Hayden. It stayed lost because that was not its true name, and because it was lost in the Dark Void. Before my creators found and transformed its interior, it was called the Wolfling World.
Now that's spooky. The Dark Void device and the sleeping Haydenman army both on the same planet. What are the chances of that?
Too damn small for my liking. If I didn't know better, I'd swear my father arranged it. It's the kind of thing he'd do.
It's far more likely that I didn't hide my trail as carefully as I thought I had. And if someone found the Wolfling world once, someone else might find it again. I think it's time we got moving.
Sounds good to me. Random looked round at the armory almost wistfully. You've got some wonderful toys here, Deathstalker.
I could have used a collection like this many times. Who are these supposed to be used against? The same people I used the device on. There was a rebellion against the Empire. Widespread, well-funded, lots of weapons, and men to use them. I destroyed them all in a moment. They weren't even offered a chance to surrender.
Wait a minute. That's not what it says in the official histories. The device was only used after every other means had been exhausted. The Empire itself was in danger. That's why they used the device.
Not they. Me. My finger on the button. There was no warning, no negotiations, and no danger to the Empire.
So why did you do it?
He was my emperor.
Giles was quiet for a long moment, and nobody said anything. Finally, he shrugged and smiled at Owen.
Winners write the histories, kinsman. You should know that.
On the star cruiser Dauntless, orbiting Chandrakor, Captain Silent studied his bridge view screen thoughtfully. According to his sensor probes, the whole planet was overrun with homicidal life forms wherever you looked. No civilizations, past or present. Except for a certain crashed starship currently on the view screen. Investigator Frost stood at his side, silent and disapproving. She'd wanted to lead the away team that was investigating the wreck, and was still sulking because he'd said no. He'd been tempted. If anyone could survive the slaughterhouse down there, it was Frost. But if the outlaws got to another ship, the Dauntless might have to leave in a hurry to go after it, even if it meant abandoning the away team, which meant he could only send down those people he could afford to lose. He sighed and made himself concentrate on the voice accompanying the view screen images.
The ship is a wreck. Extensive damage before and after landing. No trace of any crew. Some human blood, not enough to be significant. The star drive is missing. Cut out very neatly. Professional. Somebody beat us to her, Captain.
Understood, Lieutenant. Continue your investigation. Captain out. He turned away from the screen to look at Frost. What do you think, Investigator? Could there be people, even bases on this planet, that the Empire doesn't know about?
Possible, Captain. They could be shielded against our sensors. That would require a great deal of power, though. Perhaps they live underground. It would make sense, given the surface conditions.
Captain! This is surveillance. We're picking something up on the planet's surface. Their shielding just dropped. Silence and Frost looked at the view screen again. The crashed ship had vanished, replaced by the image of an immense stone castle. What the hell is that?
A castle. Sometimes called a standing, similar to those of the Empire aristocracy 9 centuries ago. They were forbidden to anyone else on pain of death. I think we can now be pretty sure of what happened to the outlaws and their star drive.
How far is it from the wreck site?
1/2 mile, Captain. The away team would be butchered before they got half that distance without extra equipment.
He's right. You're going to need a full company of Marines, armed and shielded to the teeth, and someone extremely experienced to lead them.
All right, Investigator, you've made your point. Silence couldn't help smiling at her. You can lead the away team this time. Make the necessary arrangements.
It's time to go. I've dropped the standing shields to divert the extra power to the takeoff. I never really thought I'd leave this planet again, but I'd hoped. There's always hope.
How far is it to your ship? Owen had a horrible suspicion his ancestor was about to get all sentimental on him, and he didn't think he could cope with that just at the moment. It better not be too far. With your shields down, we're a sitting target for the star cruiser up above.
Oh, it's not far. Not far at all. Computers, begin liftoff procedures.
Owen looked blankly at his ancestor as the room began to shake and rumble around him. Far below, under his feet, he could hear the building roar of mighty engines. Wait a minute! Wait just a damn minute!
Your ship is part of the Standing? We're in it now?
Not part. The Standing is the ship, and vice versa.
We're going into hyperspace in a stone castle that's been sitting around for 9 centuries?
We built to last in my day. Talk to your computer if you want more details.
Oz, are you still there? Talk to me.
Yes, I'm still here. You wouldn't believe how cramped it is. Some of these systems are positively prehistory. I can't believe I'm supposed to live in something this small. There isn't room to swing a neuron.
Talk to me about the castle, Oz, or I swear I'll reprogram you with a blunt spoon. Is it really a starship?
Oh, yes. A bit slow and stately, but it'll get you there. Hang on to your hat, Owen. It's going to be rather a bumpy takeoff.
On the bridge of the Dauntless, Silence and Frost watched speechlessly as the last standing of the Deathstalker clan tore itself out of the ground and leapt up into the air. Powerful energies roared around it. The jungle was flattened for miles around by the backblast, but the castle rose into the air as smoothly as any starship.
I don't believe it. A stone starship?
We've lost contact with the away team, Captain.
Gunnery officer, open fire! Blow that thing to rubble!
We can't, Captain. It's got one of the most powerful force shields I've ever seen. We don't have anything that'll breach it.
Fire on it anyway. It's got to have a weak spot.
I wouldn't put money on it.
And then the castle shimmered and was gone into hyperspace. And there was nothing left to look at on the view screen but space. Damn.
Yeah. The Empress is not going to be pleased, is she?
Silence sat back in his command chair and made himself think calmly. They might think they've gotten away, but it's not over yet. After all, we know where they're going. Down in Wormboy Hell. Finley Campbell fled for his life, hunted and harried, and the pack came after him, snapping at his heels. He was the Campbell now, last scion of a butchered line, and the wolves came after him, merciless and determined. He guided the stolen gravity sled between the narrow towers of the city center, whipping past mirrored windows at incredible speeds. Adrienne lay on the deck behind him, awash with blood, curled around the wide, awful wound in her gut that was slowly killing her. The rushing wind blew tears from Finley's eyes, and he wished he'd taken the time to steal some goggles along with the sled, but there'd been no time. No time at all. It had been a long time since he'd last flown a gravity sled, but old memories and skills were already coming back. He swung the sled round in a sudden sharp arc, bracing himself against the pull of gravity, using the updrafts and thermals that came and went between the high towers. He looped around, gunning the motor, and found himself above a single wolf sled that had made the mistake of speeding just a little too far ahead of the pack. Finley's mouth stretched in a humorless smile, a savage death's head grin that was usually hidden behind the steel helm of the masked gladiator. None of his family would have recognized him at that moment, but they would have been forced to admit it didn't look out of place on him. He moved in close behind the desperately bucking and weaving sled before him, and activated his sled's weapons. Twin disruptor beams tore into the rear of the wolf sled. The heavy steel shielding blew apart in a shower of sparks and jagged fragments, and the wolves screamed as their engines suddenly cut out. The sled dropped like a stone to the ground far below, and the occupant screamed all the way down. Finley sped on through the forest of steel and glass towers, confident the remaining wolves would keep their distance for a while. Time was on their side, and they could afford to wait for the best advantage. Finley smiled suddenly, and his hands moved over the control panels with new confidence. Tower Shrek wasn't far, and Evangeline had an apartment there. He was reluctant to involve his secret love in his troubles, but he didn't have any choice. Adrienne was dying, and Evangeline had a regeneration machine in her apartment. He'd given it to her some time ago, and she kept it hidden for him, in case he ever needed it, in an emergency. No one would think to look for it there, because no one knew about him and Evangeline. No one could ever know. Whatever happened, she had to be protected. He scowled unhappily as he realized what that meant. He would have to kill or shake off all his pursuers before he could head for Tower Shrek. But on the other hand,
Adrienne's time was running out. If he didn't get her help soon, it would be too late. He swore dispassionately. He couldn't do it alone, and there was only one person he could think of who might help him. Someone who had every reason to hate his guts. He patched into the sled's comm unit through his implant and entered a number he hadn't thought to use again anytime soon.
This is Finley Campbell, last survivor of the first rank of the family. I invoke clan loyalty, blood to blood. Can you hear me, Robert?
There was a long pause, and then a dry voice was suddenly in his ear.
This is Robert, and you've chosen a hell of a time to get in touch.
I'm sorry. I know you're still in mourning over Letitia.
Mourning be damned! I haven't got the time anymore. Everything's gone to hell here. The whole family's under attack. Wolves and Campbells are fighting it out in the streets down to the most remote cousins. I'm barricaded in my own home. The Wolves have declared full vendetta, a death sentence on every Campbell, down to the last man, woman, and child. They're firebombing our businesses, attacking our houses. I'm trying to put together some kind of resistance, but they caught us with our pants down and tangled round our ankles. Luckily, I made some friends in the military, and they're helping out. The authorities are just standing back and watching. They won't get involved in family quarrels. Bottom line, we're outnumbered, caught unprepared, and a lot of us are dead. What's your position, Finley? And who's the Campbell now?
Currently, I'm running for my life on a stolen gravity sled. The wolves right behind me, yelling for blood. I'm the Campbell now, if anyone is. All the others are dead. Any chance your people could help, if I could get to you?
Negative. We're surrounded on all sides. You're on your own, Finley.
Nothing changes. All right, listen to me. I've got Adrienne with me, and she's badly hurt. I'm taking her to Tower Shrek. I know someone there who'll help her. Don't ask questions, there isn't time. I'm going to leave Adrienne there with Evangeline Shrek, and then go to ground. With me gone, the last of the first rank, you should be able to sue for peace. The Empress won't allow a full vendetta for long. She doesn't want any single family getting that powerful. In the meantime, I need you and your people to break out, get to Tower Shrek, and protect Adrienne until she's ready to leave. I know that's asking a lot, but I'm not asking for myself. Will you come?
I'll try. She was good to me. Can we expect much help from the Shreks?
I very much doubt it.
Don't want much, do you? Where are you going?
Damned if I know. Going to find a hole and pull it in after me. I'll have to disappear for a while. That means you'll be the Campbell. I don't know what kind of a family you'll be heading after the dust has settled, but remember, do whatever you have to do to protect and preserve the clan. Make a deal with the wolves. Promise them anything. There'll be time for revenge later.
I'll do what I can. Ironic, isn't it? Me, as the Campbell. After what happened at the wedding, I was ready to divorce myself from the family, take a new name, and give my life entirely to the military. But I can't do that now, can I? There are too many people who are going to be depending on me. The family has me in its bloody clutch again. All right, Finley, I'll talk to some of my friends in the military, see if they can get me safe passage through the chaos in the streets. I'll be there as soon as I can.
Finley's implant went dead. Not as much help as he'd hoped, but more than he'd expected, or had any right to. The family had not treated Robert well. Finley smiled slightly. Hopefully, Robert would treat the family rather better now that he was the Campbell. He looked over the sled's control panels, and then looked away, satisfied he was still squeezing every ounce of speed he could out of the straining motor. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. Gravity sleds weren't designed with this kind of abuse in mind. He shrugged mentally. Either the sled would hold together, or it wouldn't. It was out of his hands, and he couldn't afford to worry about it anymore. He had to think. So, if he could just get Adrienne safely to Evangeline at Tower Shrek, he might find a way out of this mess yet. He glanced back over his shoulder. The wolf sleds were still hanging back, wary of him. They were easily within disruptor range, but at the speeds they were all traveling now, the chances of a hit were extremely low. And besides, if they missed, the odds were they'd end up slaughtering innocents in some nearby tower, and the claims for damages from the wounded families would be enormous. Even so, the wolves wouldn't hold off much longer for fear of losing him, and there was no way they'd leave him alone till he reached Tower Shrek. Finley grimaced unhappily. He had to deal with them now, while he still had the advantage of surprise, and he had to make it quick for Adrienne's sake. He'd already decided what he was going to do while he was talking to Robert. It was risky and dangerous and depended far too much on luck and bluff, but it was all he had. He bent over the controls before he could talk himself out of it, and turned the gravity sled around in a tight arc and sent it hammering toward the steel and glass face of the nearest tower. He braced himself as the wall loomed up before him like a great gleaming fly swatter. Beyond the illuminated windows, he could see people jumping to their feet and pointing. Some turned to run. Finley drew his gun and fired at the growing expanse of window. The heavy steel glass shattered as the energy beam tore through it, blasting lethal fragments through the office space beyond. People fell, spurting blood, and did not rise again. Finley didn't have time to care. They were innocents, but they weren't family. He steered the sled through the great jagged opening in the tower face, then hit the brakes for all he was worth. The sled shuddered to a halt halfway across the long office floor, almost throwing Finley off. He hung on desperately. Adrienne's unconscious form rolled forward to press against the backs of his legs. He leaned on the controls for a moment to get his breath back. His arms and legs were shaking from shock and reaction, and he ran through the calming chants the previous masked gladiator had taught him. In the arena, control was everything. People were crying and screaming all around him, but as yet there was no sign of any security guards. He turned the sled around so that it was facing toward the gaping hole in the window. The wolf sleds had slowed to a halt well back from the shattered window and were hovering outside the tower, watching cautiously to see what he'd do next. They didn't seem too worried. After all, there was nowhere he could go now. He'd trapped himself. Finley's death's head grin stretched across his face again as he reached down into the top of his boot and drew out the small slab of explosive he carried there. Ever since he became the masked gladiator and acquired so many enemies, he'd always known that someday his true identity might be revealed, and he'd have to fight his way out of an impossible situation. Hence the explosive for a last resort. Finley had always believed in being prepared, in and out of the arena. He slipped the explosive into his belt, where he could get at it easily, and grinned out at the wolf sleds, daring them to come in after him. After all, he was only Finley Campbell, the notorious fop. What could he know about tactics and traps? The wolves held a brief conference, and then one sled nosed slowly forward. They knew it had to be a trap, but they couldn't see how. Finley grinned till his cheeks ached.
Keep coming, you bastards. Just a little closer.
The sled drifted in through the break in the window, giving the jagged shards plenty of room, and then moved on into the office. Finley hit the controls, and his sled jumped forward. The wolves fired their sled's disruptors, but Finley's sled was already upon them. The two hulls slammed together, sending the wolves staggering. Finley had braced himself, and his hand was perfectly steady as he raised his gun and shot the wolf pilot. The energy beam tore right through the wolf's chest and through his burning body over the side of the sled. The remaining wolves grabbed for their guns, but Finley had already jumped onto their sled and was among them, sword in hand. He cut and hacked with his blade, trading skill for speed, and blood flew in the air. The wolves couldn't fire for fear of hitting each other, and there wasn't room or time to draw their swords. They fought back desperately anyway, but they'd been caught unprepared, and he was the masked gladiator. They never stood a chance. Finley cut down the last man with cold efficiency, kicked the body over the side, and then sheathed his sword. The wolves on the other sleds were rushing forward, shouting their anger and outrage. Disruptor bolts shot past him. He grabbed the slab of explosive from his belt, slapped it against the deck of the sled so it would stick, and activated the timer built into it for a 20-second fuse. Then he turned the wolf sled around and sent it back toward the approaching craft. 15. He timed his moment carefully, and then jumped off. 10. He hit the floor hard and rolled behind a heavy desk. 5. The sled slammed into the midst of the wolves and blew apart in a gush of flames. The other sleds exploded as their drives ruptured, and for a long moment the office was full of jagged metal shrapnel raining down, interspersed with wet, soft parts of what had once been their crew. A fireball blazed briefly in the confined space, but quickly ran out of air and collapsed. Finley huddled in a ball beneath his sheltering desk, hands pressed tightly to his ears against the overpowering roar of the explosion. As he realized a silence had fallen, he slowly lowered his hands, uncurled, and cautiously raised his head to look about him. Fires had broken out all across the office, with desks burning fiercely here and there like so many warning beacons. Dead and injured lay to every side. some of them burning quietly. Finley didn't spare them more than a glance. He didn't know them. Adrienne was all that mattered now. He saw a red light flashing over a door, and wondered why the alarms weren't sounding. He slowly realized from the utter silence around him that they probably were, but he couldn't hear them. The blast had temporarily deafened him. At least, he hoped it was only temporary. He didn't need another problem. He rose painfully to his feet and stumbled toward his own sled, still hovering where he'd left it. Burning fragments sputtered on the deck around Adrienne, but she seemed unhurt by them. Finley brushed the fragments off the deck with a sweep of his arm and climbed aboard. It was growing uncomfortably hot in the office as the fire spread, and his bare skin was beginning to smart from the heat. The office should have invested in sprinklers. For a moment that struck Finley as wildly funny, and he giggled helplessly before pulling himself together. He looked down at Adrienne. The deck was slippy with her blood where it hadn't burnt, and her hands were wet and crimson where they tried to hold her guts together. Her face was worryingly colorless, but she was still breathing shallowly. Finley eased the sled forward and out through the break in the window, and headed for Tower Shrek. Evangeline was getting ready for bed, even though it wasn't late. Daddy was coming over for one of his little visits. So she sat in her long white nightdress before her dressing table mirror, listlessly brushing her hair and thinking about killing herself. She knew she wouldn't. She had so much to live for, apart from Daddy, and it would hurt Finley so very much. The mood would pass, as it had so many times before. But for a moment it was comforting to think of ending it all and not having to worry anymore. She wouldn't have to worry about being revealed as a clone, or a member of the underground, or seeing Finley die in the arena, or suffering through another of Daddy's little visits ever again. And that would feel so good. So good. If society found out about Gregor and her, no one would punish him, but no one would speak to him either. They'd send him to Coventry, in and outside his family, and that would be worse than death to an aristocrat. Of course, if they found out he'd murdered his wife and his original daughter. Evangeline sighed tiredly. So many secrets in one family. Her comm implant activated suddenly, and she sat up straight before her mirror. She'd shut down all the public channels, and only one man apart from her father knew her private code.
Evangeline, this is Finley. I'm in trouble. Can I come to you?
Of course.
It never even occurred to her to say no.
Where are you?
Right outside your window. Open up, will you? It's cold out here.
She jumped up and ran over to the window. The drapes rolled back at her quick gesture, revealing a blood-spattered Finley standing on a gravity sled, hovering on the other side of the steel glass. Even with the surprise of his arrival and the shock of his condition, her first thought was still to wonder how he'd got past Tower Shrek's security. He should have set off any number of alarms just by being there. Even with her beloved Finley, she was still a Shrek. She deliberately pushed the thought aside and hit the emergency controls in the window surround. The great pane of steel glass swung open, and Finley guided the sled forward into her room. The sled took up a hell of a lot of space, even hovering an inch or so above the floor, and Evangeline had to squeeze past it to shut the window again. Finley stepped down from the sled.
Don't worry about security. I've got a little device that takes care of things like that. It's part of what helps protect my secrets. Security won't know I was ever here.
Evangeline seethed impatiently, a dozen questions on her lips, but they died stillborn as she saw the blood spilling off the sled and onto her thick carpets. At first she thought he'd been badly hurt after all, but then her eyes fell on the huddled form lying on the deck of the sled, and her heart nearly stopped when she recognized who it was. Adrienne Campbell. Possibly the woman she hated more than anyone, except her father. And Finley had brought her here. Finley picked up his wife with a strained grunt, which more than anything showed how tired and drained he was, and carried her over to Evangeline's bed. He lowered her carefully onto it, then sat down beside her. The last of his strength seemed to go out of him then, and his chin dropped onto his chest as his shoulders slumped. Somewhere in the back of Evangeline's mind, she was wondering how the hell she was going to get all that blood out of her carpets and bedclothes without hiring a dozen new maids, but she made herself concentrate on what was important. Finley needed her help. She moved quickly over to the drinks cabinet, poured out a large brandy, and brought it to him. She had to push the glass into his hand and encourage him to drink it, but the brandy quickly put some color back into his cheeks, and his eyes cleared. Evangeline knelt down before him, her knees squelching on the bloody carpet.
What's happened, Finley? Did you kill her?
No. It was the wolves. She's dying, Evie. I have to save her. Do you still have the regeneration machine?
Of course I do, but...
I know, but I can't let her die. Please, Evie.
All right. Because you ask.
She got to her feet, moved over to the dressing table, and dragged it to one side. She activated the hidden controls by hand, carefully punching in the correct code, and part of the wall slid up as the regeneration machine rolled out. Gregor wasn't the only Shrek with secrets. She opened up the long, narrow device, thinking it looked even more like a coffin than usual, and pushed it over beside the bed. Finley picked up Adrienne very gently, ignoring the blood that coursed down his front again, and lowered her into the regeneration device. It closed over her like a grave, and that was that. Her fate was in the hands of the machine now, and all he could do was wait and see. Finley sat down on a nearby chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and Evangeline stood before him, her back straight, her mouth a cold, flat line. She didn't need to say anything. Finley took a deep breath.
Adrienne and I are the only survivors of the first rank of the Campbells. Everyone else is dead. The wolves wiped us out. They declared full vendetta and ambushed us in our own tower. They're after me too, but I shook them off. I shouldn't have come here, but I didn't know where else to go.
Of course you should have come here. No one can hurt you now you're with me. I'm just glad you escaped. Oh, Finley, your whole family.
Yes, only the minor branches and the distant cousins remain now, and the wolves are out in the streets, hunting them down. Clan Campbell is finished.
And Adrienne? What happened to her? Why did you bring her here?
Kid Death stuck her when she tried to save my brother. I'll kill him for that someday. Her only hope was the regeneration machine I left here with you.
But why bring her here at all? Why not let her die? She's always come between us, and you said you never loved her. This is our chance, Finley. All we have to do is switch off the machine and wait. Don't look at me like that. You don't know how hard it's been for me alone without you. You don't know.
I can't just let her die. She doesn't deserve that. She fought so bravely. And as for you and me, there's a price on my head, now that Clan Campbell's been all but destroyed. We can never be together in society like we'd hoped, because I'm not a part of society anymore. The minute I show my face in public, I'm a dead man. Robert will be the Campbell now, and all he can do is try to salvage as much of the family as he can. He can't help me. He daren't. He might be able to save Adrienne, if she survives. He's on his way here with help. My only chance now is to become an outlaw, go underground. You always said you wanted to be with me, no matter what. Do you still feel that way? Are you willing to throw everything away, give up wealth and station, to be an outlaw with me? Will you come down into the underground with me?
She sat down beside him and held him as tightly as she could.
Of course I will, Finley. You're all I ever wanted.
They sat together for a while in silence, holding each other. And then the regeneration machine made a series of imperative noises. Finley and Evangeline got up reluctantly and went over to look at the readouts. Finley nodded slowly, and Evangeline kept her face carefully blank.
She's in bad shape, but the device has stabilized her. It's going to be some time before the machine's finished with her, and we can't wait that long.
You said Robert was coming here?
With a few friends from the military. They'll look after her and keep her safe.
Tower security won't let him in. Daddy's been even more paranoid than usual just recently, after the incident at the wedding. His guards have orders to shoot anyone who tries to get to me that isn't a Shrek. You said you had a device.
It's an implant. Nothing I can pass on to Robert. Someone has to stay with her, Evie. I can't just abandon her. She deserves better than that.
All right, let me think.
Evangeline wrapped her arms tightly around herself and paced up and down.
There's more going on here than you know, Finley. There are things I never told you. Things about me.
Finley smiled.
I know all I need to know.
Shut up, Finley. You don't understand. I had to keep this secret, even from you. I'm a clone, and a member of the Underground.
She saw the look that came over his face, and wouldn't let herself look away.
The original Evangeline died in an accident. Daddy couldn't bear to live without her, so he had me cloned. Secretly. Don't look at me like that, Finley. Please. I'm still the same person I've always been.
Are you? I don't know anymore. I don't know anything anymore. How long ago did all this happen? Is the woman I originally loved dead? Have I been loving a copy ever since?
No. It happened long before we ever fell in love. There's only ever been you and me.
How can I be sure of that?
You can't. You have to trust me.
How can I after this? I told you everything about me, even about the masked gladiator, and you kept this from me.
I had to. I knew you'd react like this.
What else have you been keeping from me?
Nothing. There's nothing else, Finley. Nothing at all.
They stood for a long moment, just staring at each other. When Evangeline finally spoke again, her voice was as calm and steady as she could make it.
We can't stay here. I can take you down into the Underground. They'll accept you if I vouch for you. The wolves can't follow you there. You'll be safe. Valentine Wolf is a member of the Underground, too.
So he could still come after me there. I'd be walking into a trap.
No. The Underground wouldn't permit it. We have very strict rules about inner conflicts. We have to, or we'd never get anything done. When you come to the Underground, you leave your other life behind. We could start again, Finley. Start afresh.
All right. All right. I can't think about all this now. We'll talk some more later, assuming we have a later. What are we going to do about Robert? He's going to be here soon with a small army of his military friends to look after Adrienne. Your father's guards will try to stop him, and I don't think he'll be in any mood to take no for an answer. He'll fight, and there's been enough killing already. How can we get him in here? Can you override your father's commands? Will his people take orders from you?
No. Daddy doesn't trust me with important decisions.
Then you'll have to talk to him. Call him and ask him for help.
Evangeline looked at him steadily.
You don't know what you're asking, Finley.
I'm asking the woman who said she loved me for help. I know you and your father don't get on, but... Look, this isn't for Adrienne. It's for me.
All right. I'll do it for you.
She moved back to her dressing table and sat down, automatically adjusting her nightgown so that it fell appealingly about her. She had to look her best for Daddy. She activated her comm unit and called her father's private number. She hugged herself tightly so she wouldn't fly apart, and then made herself let go. Like so many times before, she had to be strong. She cut off the comm link, and her father disappeared, replaced by her own face in the mirror's reflection. She turned away from the mirror and looked at Finley dispassionately. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring down at his clenched hands, lost in thought. He was soaked in blood, some of it his own, but he'd never even mentioned his own wounds. He couldn't know what his favor had cost her, what she'd had to promise. He must never know. If he did, he'd throw away his own life to kill her father, and she couldn't allow that. She needed him too much. But she wondered if she'd ever feel quite the same about him again.
What are you thinking about?
Finley didn't look up.
My family. They're all dead. I miss them. My father's dead, and I never got a chance to tell him about the real me. He'll never know I was really a warrior, just like him. And William and Gerald are gone. They were there all my life, looking after me, being there when I needed them. Now they're all gone. And there's just me. I'm not even a Campbell anymore. I don't know what I am.
You're the man I love. The man who loves me. I'm your life now. Or isn't that enough for you?
He looked up at her then.
I always said you were all I ever really wanted. Seems I had to lose everything else to find out that was true after all. I love you, Evie, never doubt it. But I loved my family too, and a part of me died with them. The rudder of my life is gone, and I don't know what to do.
We get on with our lives. You'll find a new purpose in the underground. I did. Now let's get moving. I think it would be best if we were both long gone before your cousin arrives with his private army.
Finley frowned.
You mean just leave Adrienne and the machine? Won't your father wonder what it was doing here?
I'll think of something plausible to tell him. Now let's go, Finley. We've done all we can here.
Finley nodded and got up off the bed.
You're right. I'm just putting it off. You lead the way, Evie, and I'll follow.
Evangeline smiled.
That's what I like to hear from a man.
She stepped past the dressing table, and a light switched itself on, revealing a concealed elevator.
This was originally intended as an emergency fire escape. Some cyber-rat friends deleted its presence from the main files, and now only I know of its existence. It'll take us down to the sub-basement. No one ever goes there. That's why no one's ever found the hidden tunnel that leads down to the subsystems below the city. You're not the only one with secrets, Finley.
The door slid silently shut behind them, and Evangeline hit the down button with her fist. The elevator began its descent, and for the first time, Evangeline relaxed a little. They were committed now. She looked straight ahead at the closed doors.
There's a place along the way where we can get fresh clothes. Neither of us are in any state to meet people. Are you badly hurt anywhere? There'll be first aid stuff there, but that's all.
I'm fine. I healed quickly.
Evangeline looked at him.
Another implant?
He shrugged.
Something like that. You need every advantage you can get in the arena. The regeneration device can work miracles, but you have to live long enough to reach it.
The dressing table will move itself back into position. There'll be no trace to show where we've gone. Daddy will be surprised when he finds I'm not waiting for him, but by then your cousin should have gotten to Adrienne.
How angry is he likely to be?
Very. Can your cousin handle a little pressure?
Oh, yes. Robert's a lot tougher than he used to be. Poor fellow. What will your father say when you do finally go back?
I don't know if I am going back. You're going to need me in your new life with the underground, and dear Daddy can go to hell. I would have disappeared into the subsystems long ago if it hadn't been for you. And if I hadn't been such a useful contact for the underground. I think that part of my life is over now. Whatever happens from now on, we'll be together. And that's all that really matters.
She still didn't look round, but her hand was in just the right place to receive his when he reached out to her. Finley looked around the meeting place with interest. An abandoned workstation by the look of it, bristling with half-repaired, obsolete equipment. Dangling cables hung from the high ceiling, and battered view screens lined the walls, hissing with static. Evangeline had said he'd be meeting the Esper leaders here so that they could check him out, but as yet there was no sign of them. There was no sign of anyone, and Finley didn't blame them in the least. The place was a dump. And then the Esper leaders appeared suddenly in the chamber before him, and for a moment his poise vanished as he stared with open eyes and mouth. He realized he was gaping and pulled himself together.
Don't worry. Everyone does that the first time they see the leaders.
Finley didn't blame them. A waterfall splashed down from high above, gurgling and splashing. An abstract pattern folded in upon itself endlessly. A giant hog with blood-stained tusks glared at him with tiny crimson eyes, and a 10-foot woman wrapped in shimmering light looked down on him with cold disinterest. Evangeline had warned him that the leaders hid their true identities behind illusions for security reasons, but he hadn't expected them to seem so real. He swallowed hard and held his head high.
Interesting friends you have, Evie. Usually, to see something like this, I'd have to ask Valentine for something from his private stash.
Shut up, Finley. You're here under sufferance. The underground has no use for the families. They've seen too many good men and women killed by the powers that be for daring to struggle to be free. The only reason you weren't shot on sight was because you were with me, and they're not always that happy about me. Now be quiet, and let me try and put in a good word for both of us.
I'm an outlaw now. That means they have to take me, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't.
It was the hog.
There are always spies and traitors seeking to destroy us from within.
And what happens to them?
I eat them.
Finley decided to let Evangeline do all the talking. He put on a respectful face and carefully kept his hands away from his sword and gun while she talked to the leaders. He looked across at the few relatively normal-looking people in the chamber with him and moved over to join them, bowing respectfully.
I'm Finley Campbell. Or I was. Not really entitled to the name anymore, I suppose. Are you part of the underground, too?
My name is Hood. I advise.
The tall man who spoke had no face. He wore a long cloak with a cowl pulled forward. There was only darkness inside the cowl.
Probably another Esper,
thought Finley. He turned his attention to the three women with the same face and gave them his most charming smile.
Don't waste it on us, stud,
said the woman on the left.
We're married.
Really? Who to?
Each other,
said the woman in the middle.
We're Stevie Blues. Call us 1, 2, and 3, but don't get us mixed up. We get very short-tempered when that happens. We're really very different. Right,
said the woman on the right, Stevie 3.
And we don't like aristos anyway.
Not many do these days. Perhaps I can help persuade you we're not all bad.
I doubt it. And if you say some of your best friends are clones, I might puke.
Finley decided to take that as an exit line and moved back to Evangeline, who seemed to be summing up. Clones, like Evangeline. She was still talking eloquently to the Esper leaders on his behalf, and there was no one else in the chamber to talk with, so he moved reluctantly back to Hood and the Stevie Blues.
My apologies for our barging in on you like this, but life up above was getting a bit frantic. Guns firing all over the place, and assassins on our tail. You know how it is.
Yes, we all do. That's why we're here. The persecution above doesn't automatically buy you acceptance in the world below.
Right.
Finley admired Stevie 3's leather and chains outfit, and wondered fleetingly how Evangeline would look in it. He realized the clone was still talking, and made himself concentrate on her face. Stevie 3 smiled nastily, as though she knew what he'd been thinking.
We don't carry passengers down here, Aristo. No matter who your enemies are. What can you do for us?
Finley's face flushed, and anger sent his hands moving automatically toward his weapons, but he made himself stop in time. It was a fair question.
I'm a fighter. Any weapons, any odds. And I'm the best you'll ever see.
The three Stevies waited, and then smiled slightly as they realized he'd said all he was going to say.
You may get a chance to prove that, Campbell, and sooner than you think.
What did happen to your face? Cut yourself shaving?
Hood turned away without answering, but all three Stevies smiled. Hood came to a halt beside Evangeline and broke into her speech without apology.
The Campbell is a complication. Valentine Wolfe is his enemy. The last thing we need is a blood feud in our midst, particularly when so much is happening. Send him away.
He comes to us in need,
said the waterfall.
Just as you did once, and he, at least, has shown us his face and told us his name. Shall we not show him the charity that was shown you? All the world above is his enemy now, as it is ours. We accept him, provisionally. Prove yourself, Campbell, and you will be made welcome. Fail or betray us, and we may kill you.
Try me. My sword is yours.
The giant hog nodded once, grunted explosively, and then turned its massive head to look at Hood.
You said you had a matter of importance to discuss with us. We are here. Talk.
In front of him?
Hood gestured disdainfully at Finley.
I protest.
He is one of us now. Accept him as we accept you.
Very well. For a long time now, we've been discussing various ways of freeing our fellow espers and clones held in prison and condemned to death for their rebellion. Most are held in Silo 9, also known as Wormboy Hell, a maximum security prison with ESP blockers by the dozen and a small army of guards. Long considered impregnable, none of our people have ever broken in or out and lived to tell of it. We've planned to storm it a dozen times, but we always had to call it off. Projected casualties were just too high. But information has come into my possession that changes everything. There's going to be a complete changeover of the guards this evening, at 2100, as the prison's new security systems are installed. For a short time, it's going to be sheer chaos in there, with new faces all over the place as they yank out the old equipment and plug in the new. The perfect time for us to launch an attack and free all our people rotting in Wormboy Hell. But we've got to go now if we're to take advantage of this opportunity. The authorities knew how vulnerable they'd be, so this was kept secret from practically everybody right up to the last moment. I only stumbled across it by chance. I've contacted as many of our people as I could reach and had them prepare for action. But I can't launch an attack this big without your approval. We've got to do this. We'll never get a better chance.
The Esper leaders turned to each other, and though they were apparently silent, Finley could all but sense the telepathic arguments crackling between them. He moved in close beside Evangeline and kept his voice low.
Fill me in, Evie. A maximum security prison just for espers and clones? How come I never heard of it before this?
Not many have. The Empire doesn't like to admit its conditioning fails as often as it does. Most espers and clones used to die trying to break free of their conditioning, but an increasing number are surviving. The Empire's tried augmenting the usual mental blocks and controls with tech and chemical implants, but they kill as many as they cure, and there's always a pressing demand for more espers and clones. We're so useful. Most failures are locked away in the usual prisons until they can be disposed of. They don't bother with trials. Clones and espers are property, not people. Silo 9 is where they send the hard cases, the ones who fought back, who questioned their orders or dared to think for themselves. And, of course, anyone found guilty or even suspected of being members of the underground. Officially, Silo 9 doesn't exist, which means they can do anything at all there that they feel like. The prisoners become just so many warm bodies used for experimentation. The Empire's always interested in improving its stock or learning better ways to control or discipline it. We're talking about psychological conditioning, genetic tinkering, and every kind of mental or physical torture you can think of. Some of it works, much of it doesn't. But there are always more warm bodies to work with. Sometimes the Empire works changes on them in the name of scientific inquiry. There are monsters in Silo 9.
And Wormboy?
He runs Silo 9. He was human once. Now he's become something else, though whether it's more or less than human depends on who you talk to. He has artificially augmented Esper abilities far beyond anything that's ever arisen naturally. He makes the prison the hell it is and enjoys every moment of it. The suffering and despair of others makes him strong. It's because of him that no one ever leaves Wormboy Hell alive.
Finley shook his head slowly.
I never knew any of this.
You never asked. As long as there were more clones and espers for you to use up as you chose, you never questioned the system that produced them.
All right. I'm sorry. There are a lot of questions I never asked. But I'm asking now. I want to know. Has anyone ever tried to break into this place before?
No one that's lived to tell of it. Silo 9 has state-of-the-art security, always. We've never been able to get past it before, but this could be the break we've been praying for. There's a lot of us who'd give our lives and die happy for a chance to bring down Wormboy Hell.
Finley looked at her steadily.
You've lost someone to Silo 9, haven't you? Someone close.
Yes. We all have. She was my friend before I was a clone, and after. She helped brief me on taking over as Evangeline. The only person I could ever really talk to. They came for her in the early hours of the morning, and I never saw her again. Daddy tried to find out what happened to her for fear she'd talk, but even he couldn't get answers about what happens to people inside Wormboy Hell.
Evangeline fell silent, and Finley couldn't think of anything to say. They looked across at Hood, who was talking persuasively again.
I've managed to infiltrate some of my own people into the incoming security forces, and I've convinced some of the braver cyber rats to run a jamming storm to coincide with our attack. They'll run interference while we get our people out and keep security from calling for outside help.
All right,
said the Hog.
We're convinced. Set things in motion. We'll spread word throughout the Esper network. You organize the clone forces. We'll begin our attack on Silo 9 in 1 hour from now. Get moving!
Hood nodded quickly with his empty cowl, turned away without acknowledging Evangeline and Finley, then strode quickly out of the chamber. Finley looked at Evangeline.
This is all happening a bit fast for me. You're really going to launch an attack on a maximum security prison, just on that man's word?
Of course. We trust Hood. We've been given good reason to in the past, and we've had plans for an attack for years, ready to take advantage of any opportunity that arose. We've dreamed of this for a long time, Finley. A lot of blood debts are going to be settled today.
But what if it all goes wrong?
Then it goes wrong. We can't miss out on a chance like this. It might not come again for decades. You can't conceive what it's like in that hellhole, Finley. None of us can.
That's not strictly true,
said the abstract pattern. Looking at it too closely made Finley's head ache, so he looked at it sideways and concentrated on the voice as it continued.
We have contact with one of our people in Silo 9. She volunteered to be captured and sent there. We spent some time preparing her so that she would appear to break under their interrogation, but still keep the deepest part of herself free and separate. We can listen in, but we can't speak to her. She knew she was almost certainly going to her death, but she still volunteered, just on the chance that we might be able to make use of her. She was ready to wait for years if need be. Have you ever cared about anything that strongly in your life, Finley Campbell?
I put my life on the line every time I entered the arena, but that was just for me. I never cared about anyone except me, until I met Evangeline. And then, I only cared about us. Maybe that's changing now. I don't know. I'm still coming to terms with everything. I can't really understand what life has been like for you.
Then let us show you.
And their thoughts swept over Finley's mind like an irresistible tide of blinding light. He was torn away in a rush of thoughts and images, and all he could do was go along with it. He could feel Evangeline's presence beside him in the churning maelstrom, and that comforted him. He stopped trying to fight it, and allowed the Esper leaders to take him where they would. He listened, and after a while, thoughts came to him that were not his own. Jenny Psycho wasn't her real name, but she had to give that up when she went undercover. She lost a great deal more when the Empire threw her into Wormboy Hell, but she somehow held on to her real name and kept it safe. One last secret hidden deep inside her, where her torturers couldn't find it. Not even Wormboy himself. To them, she was still Jenny Psycho, captured terrorist. Just as the Esper leaders had planned, though she'd forgotten that. She'd forgotten a lot of things. It was the only way to survive. She lay curled in a ball, naked and shivering, on the bare concrete floor of her cell. There was no furniture or any other luxury. Just 4 bare stone walls surrounding a space maybe twice the size of an average coffin, with a ceiling so low she couldn't stand upright without stooping. They dropped her in, sealed the lid shut, laughed, and then left her alone in the darkness. They dropped food and water in through a sliding vent in the ceiling, but no one ever talked to her. Except Wormboy. She used to scream a lot, but all that got her was a sore throat, so she stopped. She used to talk to herself, but she ran out of things to say. She smelt bad. The stench in her cell rose and fell just enough to keep her from getting used to it. She suspected that was deliberate. It was the sort of thing Wormboy would do. They caught her easily. It seemed to her there was a reason for that, but she'd forgotten it. As a low-level Esper, it had been her job to mentally test and examine babies developing in the womb to discover whether they had any trace of Esp in them. If they did, they were either aborted or taken away at birth to begin a lifetime of training and conditioning, depending on whether it was a useful kind of Esp, of course. The mothers all looked at her with the same controlled desperation, and she gave them all the same brief, meaningless smile. And for a long time, she just did her job, doing as she was told, as she'd been trained. But constant exposure to so many bright, innocent, unsullied minds was finally too much for her. She began using her talents to conceal the baby's Esp. It wasn't difficult. The Esper abilities would still appear in later life, but at least that way they had a chance at a safe, normal, free life. Security found out. She hadn't tried that hard to conceal it. Defiance, perhaps, or maybe some last trace of her own conditioning, or something else that she'd forgotten. Either way, they caught her. And now here she was, alone in the dark, with a worm in her head, down in Wormboy hell. Light began seeping into her cell from somewhere, a sickly yellow light that made her think of disease and decay. And there in the cell with her, crawling out of the shadows in splashes of bloody amniotic fluid, came the babies. Bald and pudgy, with barely formed arms and legs, they crawled over and around her, a living carpet of unforgiving flesh. Unfinished fetuses squirmed spasmodically on the concrete floor, trying to squeeze in between her and the floor, as though trying to crawl back into the wombs from which they'd been prematurely torn. She wanted to love them all, poor blameless innocents. But she knew what was coming next. They came from Wormboy. Teeth appeared in all the babies' mouths, sharp, jagged teeth thrusting up through torn, bloody gums, and slowly, deliberately, they began to eat her alive. Jenny always swore that this time she wouldn't scream, but she always did in the end. Teeth ripped at her flesh as she screamed and screamed, and blood ran down to pool thickly on the floor. As the pain and the horror mounted, pudgy fingers began to pry at her squeezed-shut eyelids to get at the eyes beneath. And even though she knew none of it was real, Jenny Psycho screamed and screamed until her throat was raw. Wormboy did so like his little games, and mind games were the best fun of all. Fat and wide and greasy like a slug, genetically engineered to never sleep or waver in his duty, Wormboy filled an entire auditorium from wall to wall, vast acres of pale, faintly luminescent flesh that rippled and folded in upon itself. His bulk covered all the floor, and his huge, distorted head pressed against the ceiling. Long tubes entered his body here and there, providing nourishment and removing wastes. He could never have eaten enough to satisfy his enormous appetite. His body's needs were taken care of by the authorities so that his mind could roam free across the prison. Wormboy's parents had been normal enough humans, but he had been designed and tampered with from the embryo onward to shape the mind and talents of the perfect jailer. He ran everything, from the computers that ran Silo 9 security to the guards who enforced his edicts, to the little pets that gave him access to every prisoner's mind. Every time someone was damned to Wormboy hell, for whatever reason, a small, genetically designed and imperially patented parasite was surgically implanted in their brain. Wormboy's worms. They blocked off the Esper's powers so they couldn't use them offensively. and secreted various useful chemicals that helped to keep the espers and clones quiet and malleable. And if by some chance an esper or a clone did find the strength of will to fight off the chemicals and try to escape, the worm would fry their brain. The worms gave him all the control he needed, and were much cheaper and easier to run than hundreds of individual S-blockers. Their designer won a major award before he disappeared into Silo 9 to ensure he never told anyone else his secrets. Wormboy liked to go among the monsters, the malformed, horrid results of esper and clone experimentation. Too dangerous ever to be released, too useful to kill, they roared and spat in their cells, clawing at the stone walls. Human no longer, but more than beasts, wild and awful, and beyond pain or fear. They defied even Wormboy's best efforts. He never gave up on them. He swept back and forth among the specially reinforced cells, walking up and down in their minds, and they screamed and howled with a rage that shook the walls. To them, he was just one more monster among many. Wormboy laughed and laughed and laughed. His mind roamed free among the prisoners of Silo 9, present in every mind, controlled by a worm, a slimy mental caress, a passing presence like a chill wind from a charnel house. Bringer of nightmares, vast and awful, horrid and merciless god of his own private hell. Finley Campbell lay curled in a ball on the floor of the abandoned workstation, shaking and shuddering. Evangeline knelt beside him, her hands cool on his feverish face, murmuring calm and soothing words. He felt sick, tainted, and invaded on every level of his mind and body. Wormboy's thoughts had ripped through his mind like poisoned barbed wire, brushing aside all his defenses as he shared everything that happened to Jenny Psycho. Neither of them had known he was there, but that just made him feel even more helpless, unable to help Jenny or any of the other victims of Wormboy's rape. Finley snarled his killer's death's head grin, his hands clenched into fists. He would find the monster in its lair and kill it, and maybe then he'd feel clean again. He ran through the calming chants he'd learned in the arena, and gradually the shaking stopped. Control slipped over him again like a cool, familiar cloak, and he sat up. Evangeline hovered over him worriedly, but he managed a small smile for her.
It's all right, Evie. I'm back. I swear to you, I never knew any of this. I never heard of Silo 9 or Wormboy or the terrible things they're doing there. If Parliament and the Company of Lords knew about this...
Many of them already do. Unofficially. They don't care. Or if they do, they manage not to think about it. Clones and espers aren't people, remember? We're property. The Empire made us so it can do whatever it wants with us.
But if the people knew, if we told them, made them understand...
You wouldn't be allowed to tell them. The production of clones and espers is too important to too many people. Stop the trade and millionaires would become paupers overnight. And what would happen to the Empire, dependent on espers for its smooth running at all levels? The Empire has a vested interest in preserving the status quo at all costs. Why do you think they spend so much time and effort in portraying the underground as ruthless terrorists? I'm sorry, Finley. This is all new to you, but we've lived with it all our lives.
I won't allow this to continue. It's wrong. It's obscene. It's against everything we're taught to believe and honor. The families are supposed to protect their people against such abuses, guard them against horrors like this.
Even clones and espers?
You were right. They are people, too.
Evangeline smiled.
Welcome to our rebellion, Finley. The attack on Silo 9 will be starting soon. Will you be joining us?
Finley smiled back at her, and his eyes were cold as death.
Try and stop me.
Which was how he came to be padding down a narrow technician's access tunnel, gun in one hand, sword in the other, leading a small army of rebels through the interconnecting guts of the Undercity. Evangeline was there at his side, a large gun looking out of place in her small, delicate hand. He had no doubt she would use it, though. She'd been there in Jenny Psycho's mind, too. Just the thought was enough to make Finley's hands tighten around his sword and gun. He had vowed upon his name and honor to find and free Jenny, or die trying. Finley glanced about him, but there were only the bare, polished walls of the tunnel and a ceiling so low he had to walk hunched over to avoid banging his head. There was darkness before his party, and darkness behind them, as the 50 or so men and women moved in a blaze of sourceless light, a bright golden glow generated by the minds of the Espers. Finley hadn't known Espers could do that, but he had a feeling there were lots of things he didn't know about Espers. He'd begun to suspect that when early on one of the Esper leaders had looked at him, and suddenly Finley had a map in his head of the long, convoluted way that would lead him into Silo 9. The map was still there, clear and distinct, though he'd never been this way before. It also told him he wasn't far from the first of the prison's outer defenses. The 50 or so men and women with him, he kept getting a different answer every time he counted because some of them weren't always there, seemed to be making a lot of noise, but Evangeline had assured him they were all telepathically shielded from detection, while cyber rats were running interference on the tech security systems. The rebels were invisible for all intents and purposes, until they began their attack, by which time they should be deep in the diseased heart of Wormboy Hell, and it would be far too late to try and stop them then. Hood strode along on Finley's other side, calm and confident. There was still no trace of any face in his cowl, which frankly spooked the hell out of Finley, but Evangeline trusted Hood, so Finley went along with it. Certainly the man showed no sign of fear or hesitation, despite the odds they'd be facing. Finley approved of that. Among all the things a warrior needed, a cool head in a dangerous situation was right at the top. The 3 Stevie Blues were striding arrogantly together some way ahead at the edge of the light, on point, in perfect step with each other, fearsome sights in their leather and chains, like young savage furies on their way to demand vengeance. Finley would have been a little more impressed by them if he hadn't been so sure they were complete and utter psychopaths, though that was probably just the kind of troops you needed on your side when you were playing Follow the Leader into Hell. There were other groups of rebels, following other routes, heading for openings in the prison's security system that Hood's people had arranged. But there was no way of knowing how they were getting on. All forms of communication, tech or telepathy, were too open to interception. Hood's plan relied on a series of lightning strikes from a dozen different directions to get in, kill Wormboy, rescue the prisoners, and get the hell out before major security reinforcements could arrive to spoil the party. Publicly, Finley approved of the plan. It had the virtue of being uncomplicated, at least. Privately, however, he couldn't help remembering his tutor's oft-repeated dictum that plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. Once the fighting started, everything tended to go to hell in a hurry. Hood seemed confident there wouldn't be much actual conflict, given the rebels' advantage of surprise. Finley wished he felt that confident, too. The 3 Stevie Blues came to a sudden simultaneous halt, lifting their guns and peering suspiciously into the gloom ahead. Stevie 1 looked back as the rest of the party came to a halt. At least, Finley thought it was Stevie 1.
There's a door here that isn't on the map. It's big and solid and very definitely locked. Should I blast it?
Not on your life. We're right on the edge of the prison itself, if the rest of the map can be trusted. A disruptor blast would set off every alarm in the place, and the cyber rats can only cover so much. Hood, it's your map and your plan. What do we do?
There's no problem. My people are waiting on the other side. They'll open the door.
He strode forward and rapped twice on the steel door. It slid upward, and lights blazed into the access tunnel, revealing an army of armed guards in the room beyond. Hood laughed and blinked out of existence.
It's a trap! Everyone back! Hood's betrayed us!
And as quickly as that, everything went to hell. There was a clamor of raised voices in the narrow corridor, with shouts and screams and a confused mess of orders and naked panic. Those at the rear turned to run, but a heavy steel door slammed down from the ceiling, cutting off their escape.
So much for telepathic invisibility,
thought Finley. He grabbed Evangeline by the arm and pulled her behind him, putting his body between her and the armed guards ahead. He just had time to wonder why they weren't firing yet, and why they were wearing masks, when thick clouds of evil-smelling gas burst out into the corridor from concealed vents in the floor. The first breath was enough to set unprotected rebels coughing and choking. Finley tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. And then, a sudden wind roared through the corridor, forcing the gas back upon the guards and dispersing it as fast as it could form. The hidden vents exploded in showers of sparks and collapsed in upon themselves, closing off the gas. Esper power crackled in the air like harnessed lightning, so thick and close that even a normal like Finley could feel it. The guards realized the gas attack wasn't working and turned their guns on the rebels. Finley raised his arm automatically, slapping at the bracelet on his wrist to activate his force shield. The roar of energy beams was deafening in the confined space, joined with the screams of the dying and the injured as rebels fell. There was the stench of burning flesh and melting metal as energy beams tore through bodies and ricocheted off the reinforced steel walls.
They knew we were coming this way. They've got us trapped in a killing field.
Finley picked a target almost without thinking and shot a guard in the head. The top of the man's skull exploded in a shower of boiled blood and brains, and the guards around him fell back, shouting with shock and disgust. They hadn't expected any resistance. Finley grinned savagely. When in doubt, do the unexpected. He ran forward, brandishing his sword, yelling for the others to follow him, and no one was more surprised than him when they did. Evangeline was there beside him, yelling her clan's war cry, and holding a sword like she knew what to do with it. The surviving Espers and clones were right behind them, firing guns if they had them, and Esper power thundered among the guards. Swords clashed on swords as the two forces slammed together, and the guards tried to make a stand. But even savagely depleted by the unexpected ambush, the rebels were still more than a match for the guards. The Stevie Blues stood together, the same grim expression on the same faces as fire roared from their hands. Guards dropped their swords and ran screaming as their clothes and hair burst into flames. Espers picked up guards with their minds and slammed them together with deadly force. Blood flew on the air. Bones cracked and skulls collapsed under the implacable mental pressure, and some guards just stood and stared with horror-filled eyes as telepaths ripped through their thoughts with tides of fear and depression and self-loathing. Eventually, Finley looked round for another target and found there were no more left. Guards lay scattered across the floor of the chamber in awkward, blood-soaked poses, like broken dolls thrown aside by a bored child. Only rebels were still standing, looking confusedly about them, and it nearly broke Finley's heart to see how few of them there were. Out of the 50 or so who'd accompanied him into Wormboy Hell, only 19 remained, and 3 of them were Stevie Blues. He took a deep breath, turned off his force shield, and flicked drops of blood from his sword. Someone would have to take charge, and it looked like it was going to have to be him. He had no real authority, but he'd spent enough time in the arena to know that sometimes confidence is everything.
All right, listen to me. You can bet there are more guards on the way here, armed to the teeth, even as I speak. We have to form a perimeter. Anyone with ESP, find a corridor opening and guard it. Everyone else, grab a gun. Anyone you see coming this way is almost certainly an enemy, so shoot on sight. If you kill the wrong person by accident, we can always apologize later. Now move it!
The Stevie Blues and a handful of others nodded unresistingly and hurried off. Finley turned to Evangeline. There was a smear of someone else's blood on one cheek, and she was staring dumbly about her at the heaped piles of the dead. There was more blood spattered across her clothes, some of it hers. Finley took her by the arm and made her turn around to face him.
Don't blank out on me now, Evie. I need to know what you know. How many other groups of us were there in this assault?
5.
Evangeline swallowed hard and visibly tried to pull herself together.
Can we contact them? See if they were ambushed too?
They were, said a quiet voice beside them. It was a short, slightly overweight man with wide eyes and an open face. He might have looked like an accountant if it hadn't been for the sword he held in a businesslike manner and the blood that soaked his sleeve to the elbow.
I'm a telepath. Denny Pindar. I heard most of them die.
Then we're on our own. I say the mission is officially aborted, and I further say we get the hell out of here.
No! If we just turn and run and the others died for nothing.
If we try to take on overwhelming odds in enemy territory for no good reason, we'll die for nothing.
No good reason. You swore a death oath to bring this place down, Finley Campbell. Is your word worth so little?
Damn. I was hoping you'd forgotten that. You're right, as usual. But what can we do with just a handful of people we've got left?
Find Worm Boy and kill him. He holds this place together. Without him, it'll fall apart into chaos. We'll be able to free the prisoners and fight our way out of here.
Great plan. Have we got time to right our wheels first? All right. Let's look at the situation. Pindar, can you detect any hidden cameras or surveillance equipment here?
The Esper concentrated, then pointed at a wall decoration that looked just like all the others. Stevie One looked back briefly from guarding her corridor opening, and the decoration burst into flames. Finley nodded his thanks.
Evie, can we contact the cyber rats? They might know more about what's going on.
No, it was set up so that they could reach us, but not the other way round. Their comm units are specially shielded. Ours aren't.
Then we'll just have to follow the map and hope it's not part of the trap, too.
A thought struck him, and he looked at Pindar.
How come they didn't use S-blockers against us? We'd have been dead in the water if they had.
The telepath shook his head.
There are no S-blockers inside Silo 9. They'd interfere with Wormboy's control. Security must have been banking on the gas and their superiority in numbers to make the difference. It did with the other groups. They never had a chance to defend themselves. If you hadn't taken the initiative away from them by rallying us to strike first, we'd have just stood there and died like the others. We're not used to combat.
He broke off, his eyes suddenly far away.
Company's coming.
Finley looked automatically to the Stevie Blues.
Can you see anyone?
You won't see them. They're shielded. They're battle espers.
Oh, shit. We're dead.
Finley glared at Evangeline.
We're not dead till I say we are. So they're battle espers. So what? We'll just stay out of their way.
We can't. They're coming from all directions.
Finley glared at him.
Don't you ever have anything positive to say? Can we fight them?
These are espers specially trained and conditioned by the Empire to fight other espers. We can't talk to them or reason with them, and they don't accept surrenders. They just kill and kill till there's no one left alive but them.
There's got to be a way to beat them. There's got to be a way. What about you, Pindar? Could you use your Esp to fight them?
If I had to.
The telepath blinked owlishly.
But they're much more powerful than any of us. And there's a lot more of them than there are of us.
They'll only outnumber us if we stand here and wait for them. So we'll go to them. God, I wish I felt as confident as I sound. Pindar, which of the approaching forces is the smallest?
The Esper thought for a moment, and then pointed at one of the corridor openings.
That way. 24 espers moving ahead of the main pack. No guards.
Then that's the way we're going. Stevie Blues, lead the way. Fry anything that moves.
Sounds good to me. Right.
The 3 Esper clones set off down the corridor at a steady trot, conserving their breath. The chains on their leathers clattered loudly, like an angry chorus. Finley hurried after them, Pindar and Evangeline on each side of him, and the rest of the party brought up the rear. It worried him that they were accepting his order so readily. It probably meant they were still in shock. If they were going to have to fight battle espers, fighting at anything less than full strength would get them all killed. It surprised Finley how much that mattered to him. They'd fought bravely. They didn't deserve to die.
Getting soft,
thought Finley. They pounded down the corridor, checking every opening as they passed, but there was no sign of anyone. Finley was pleasantly surprised to note that they were still more or less following the original route on the map. If they stuck with it, it should lead them right to Wormboy. Eventually. It worried him that they hadn't encountered more guards. They must have been withdrawn to keep them out of the way of the battle espers. They rounded a corner, and then the Stevie Blues skidded to a halt as Pindar shouted for them to stop. The party stumbled to a ragged halt, lifting guns and swords and glaring about them. Pindar stared straight ahead, frowning harshly. Finley moved in close beside him and kept his voice low.
What is it? What do you see?
It's what I don't see. There should be some background random mental noise, but there's nothing. Nothing at all.
Finley turned to the Stevie Blues.
Roast the corridor ahead till it glows.
Stevie One grinned.
My kind of plan. Right.
A roaring wave of flame swept down the corridor as they concentrated, scorching the walls on either side till they glowed crimson. And then the fire stopped, thrown back by an invisible barrier. An Esper just behind Finley began to shake and shudder. People backed away from him as he convulsed. Blood gushed from his mouth and nose and ears. Finley grabbed the Esper by the shoulders, but the violent shaking threw him off. Evangeline pulled him away. The Esper exploded into a crimson mist that filled the corridor, spattering everyone with blood and worse. Finley aimed and fired his disruptor in one swift movement, and then watched incredulously as the energy beam ricocheted off an invisible screen.
"Battle Espers," said Pindar. "Trained to perfection, conditioned beyond fear or weakness, programmed to fight to the death. Yours or theirs, the most powerful Espers ever collected together. Supposedly, you'd need disruptor cannon to break through one of their 4 screens, and even then you'd get better odds betting against the cannon."
I'm getting tired of you. You only ever tell me things I don't want to hear. Don't you have anything positive to suggest?
"Yes. Get them before they get us."
He stepped forward to form a line with the other Espers, and they stood silently together, staring down the corridor. A group of the battle Espers suddenly appeared to face them, and for a long moment, all they did was stand there and stare at each other. A trickle of blood ran slowly down from Pindar's left nostril. Another of his group began to shiver uncontrollably. More of the rebel Espers came forward to face the Imperial forces. The corridor floor wrenched itself apart, splitting open in a long, jagged line that shot toward the battle Espers. It stopped several feet short. And that just left the Stevie Blues. They stepped forward in one simultaneous movement, brushed the hair out of their faces with the same hand, and frowned the same frown as they concentrated. Heat gathered on the air before them, savage and blistering. The walls on either side of them glowed a sullen red. The air shimmered. Beads of sweat ran down the Stevie Blues' faces, either from the heat or their concentration, and the angry blush on the steel walls began to move toward the battle Espers. It got about halfway there, slowed to a crawl, and then inched to a halt, no matter how hard the Stevie Blues scowled. Finley looked around, but the only people left uninvolved in the silent Esper duel were him and Evangeline. He reached over to one of the rebel Espers, took the gun from his unresisting hand, and tried another shot at the Imperial Espers. The energy beam faded out before it reached them, but it seemed to Finley that it got a lot closer than the last one. He reached out for another gun.
No! Energy weapons aren't the answer. They can control and absorb energy.
Then what do you suggest?
The two sides are pretty much deadlocked. The battle Espers are so hyped up on drugs and mental implants they'd sooner die than surrender or back off. But with a bit of luck, that also means they're too involved with the struggle on a mental plane to defend themselves against a purely physical attack.
So what do you want me to do? Rush over there and bang their heads together?
I was thinking of something a little more... dramatic.
She fished in one of her pockets and pulled out a large, round object.
Shrapnel grenade. Simple, effective, and extremely nasty at close range.
She pressed the stud, knelt down, and rolled the grenade along the floor toward the battle Espers. It seemed to move slower and slower all the time, but finally it got there. Finley grabbed Evangeline, pulled her down, and wrapped his body around hers as a shield. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, and shrapnel ricocheted off the steel walls, falling like jagged rain. An unfelt pressure in the corridor was suddenly gone, and Finley rose unsteadily to his feet. His ears were ringing, and his balance wasn't all that it might have been. He discovered a sharp metal fragment sticking out of his thigh, looked at it dispassionately, and pulled it out. The wound didn't bleed much. Evangeline stood up beside him, and he checked to make sure she was all right. She had a nasty cut on her forehead, dribbling blood down her face, but otherwise looked okay, except that she was glaring at him.
Will you stop grabbing me and pulling me around? I am quite capable of remembering to duck on my own, thank you.
Her voice sounded harsh but far away, as though they were both underwater. Finley felt a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, but controlled himself. He didn't think Evangeline was in the mood to see the funny side.
Where did the grenade come from?
Daddy always made sure that the female members of the family went around fully armed, after the iron bitch took my cousin to be a maid. I thought a gun was a bit obvious and too easily guarded against, so I decided on a grenade. But I suppose it shows I am my father's daughter after all.
Finley decided he wasn't going to pursue that point any further just at the moment, and moved among the slowly rousing Espers, checking they were all right. They'd all been blown off their feet by the blast, but no one was actually dead. Several had nosebleeds or headaches, and they'd all been cut or pierced here and there by ricocheting shrapnel, but they were taking it well. Finley took a deep breath and moved slowly down the corridor to get a better look at what was left of the battle espers. He stopped quite a way short, rather than step in the blood and gore. A few of the mangled bodies were recognizable. Most weren't. He heard footsteps behind him and looked back, expecting Evangeline, but it was Stevie too. He recognized the different colored ribbons in her hair. She looked at the carnage unflinchingly.
There but for the grace of God go I. My sisters and I were created specifically to be the new generation of battle espers. We got away, but we had to leave a lot of friends behind. I wonder, if I looked hard enough through this mess, would I find familiar faces?
Best not to look. Best not to know.
She nodded, turned away, and walked back to her sisters. Finley followed her back and rejoined Pindar and Evangeline.
All right, which way now? You can bet reinforcements are on the way, and I don't think we're up to facing down large numbers of battle espers again.
The plan hasn't changed. Find Wormboy, kill him, free the prisoners.
Just us?
Who else is there?
What about Jenny Psycho?
Evangeline frowned at Pindar.
What about her? We'll free her when we free the others.
I think we need her. The Underground arranged for her to be brought here for a reason. She's powerful. More powerful than even she knew. She was supposed to be the key to killing Wormboy.
We don't have time for this, and we don't have time for her. Jenny Psycho will have to wait. It's a straight run to Wormboy now. We've got to get him before the Empire can set up extra protection.
I think we can safely assume that happened the moment we breached Silo 9's defenses. And someone or something like Wormboy isn't going to be easy to kill. I think we should take all the help we can get.
That's not why you want to free her. She's the one you saw in your vision. You swore your oath because of her. You see yourself as the hero rushing in to sweep her away to safety. You can't afford to let this get personal, Finley. They're all Jenny Psychos in here. They're all equally deserving, and the best way to save them is to kill the beast that holds them captive.
Finley frowned, thinking, and then turned to Pindar.
Can you contact her, mind to mind? Is she still open to us?
I don't see why not. In fact, at this range I should be able to manage full contact.
He stared blankly ahead, reaching out with his mind, and his face brightened as he made contact.
Jenny, this is the Underground. We're here to rescue you.
And then Jenny Psycho came fully awake for the first time. And everything changed again. Her mind ignited like a flare, bright and blinding, almost too painful to look at. The espers in the corridor clapped their hands uselessly to their ears as her voice shook like thunder in their minds. Even Finley and Evangeline could hear her, as though she was right there in the corridor with them.
I remember who and what I am. Go to Wormboy, destroy him. I will free the prisoners.
The godlike voice was suddenly gone from their heads, and the espers slowly lowered their hands from their ears, looking at each other in shock. Telepathically deafened for the moment, they babbled at each other aloud. Finley tried to make sense of it, but all he could make out was a name, repeated over and over. Mater Mundi, Mother of the World. Once again, Finley turned to Pindar and Evangeline.
What the hell was that? This is something else you haven't got around to telling me about, isn't it? Who is she? Somebody talk to me!
Our Mother of all souls. The most powerful telepath ever created. She founded the Underground. No wonder no one was allowed to know who Jenny Psycho really was. Not even her. If the Iron Bitch knew she was here, she'd nuke the whole city just on the chance of getting her. If the Mother wants us to go after Wormboy, we are going after Wormboy. You don't argue with God when she speaks to you directly. Not unless you want to be turned into a burning bush.
You think she's God?
Nearest local equivalent. Oh, my head feels like it's been scoured out with steel wool. She's not just a telepath, Finley. More like a force of nature. Let's go find Wormboy. Which turning do we take?
Left,
said Stevie 3. It didn't take them long to get there, with the map burning in their brains like a grail. The corridors were eerily empty. There was no trace of the other battle espers anywhere, nor of any of the armed guards. The only sound in Silo 9 with their own boots thudding on the metal floors. And so on they went, along corridors and down stairways, sinking deeper and deeper into Wormboy hell, until finally they came to a huge, featureless wall, and there was nowhere else to go. Finley studied the map in his head, but it was definitely a dead end. Beyond the wall there was just a great empty space. And then he studied the map more carefully and frowned. For an empty hall there were a hell of a lot of pipes and conduits and energy cables going in and out. And so he realized what he'd really known all along, but hadn't wanted to admit. They'd finally come to Wormboy's lair.
All that space just for him? How big is he?
The word is they're going to have to build him a new home. He's getting too big for this one.
Finley decided he wasn't going to think about that for the moment.
All right. How do we get to him? What kind of defenses has he got?
He doesn't need any defenses. He's Wormboy. There are no guards, no high-tech security systems. Just him. And that's enough. He's the strongest Esper the Empire Labs ever produced. A mind so advanced as to be beyond our comprehension. Vast, unknowable, and inhumanly powerful. And possibly quite insane.
You're just full of good news, aren't you? He can't really be that powerful, can he?
No one knows. No one's ever got this close to him before. And even allowing for imperial hyperbole, he's got to be pretty damned amazing to run a prison the size of Silo 9. He has continuous mental contact with thousands of minds through his worms, and he knows what all of them are thinking at any given moment. Just another reason why no one has ever escaped from Wormboy hell.
This gets better all the time.
He hefted the gun and sword in his hands, but the familiar weights had lost all power to comfort him. He glared at the long, featureless steel wall before him, and it stared back, giving nothing away.
Anything will die if you hit it hard enough and long enough. How do we get to him? Is there a door somewhere?
No doors, no windows. Wormboy isn't going anywhere. They built the hole around him and then sealed it shut. We'll have to break in.
Great. Got any more grenades up your sleeve?
You don't need a grenade. You've got us. Never met a wall that could keep us out. Right.
They moved forward to stand before the great steel wall and stared at it thoughtfully. The temperature in the corridor rose sharply, and Finley and the others backed away to a safe distance. The wall before the three Espers glowed a cheerful cherry red and began to steam. It got hotter and hotter in the corridor, and slender rivulets of melting metal ran down the wall. The heat before the Stevie Blues had to be unbearable. They stood their ground. They held each other's hands as sweat ran down their faces, and more molten metal ran down the wall. Finally, the metal collapsed inward like sticky toffee, and a hole appeared. A terrible stench entered the corridor, of rotting flesh and waste products. The Stevie Blues pulled the same disgusted face and scowled even harder. The hole grew bigger, the metal running away like water, and everyone got their first glimpse of Wormboy. Finley edged forward, one arm raised to protect his face from the heat, and stared in sick fascination at the endless stretch of luminous flesh, pierced here and there by pipes as thick as a normal man's arm. The wounds had healed around the pipes in rucks of crumpled flesh, encrusted by trickles of escaped waste. By peering up through the widening hole, now the size of a door, Finley could just make out one side of a vast, inhuman face. The skin was stretched inhumanly taut, so that normal expressions were impossible, but even as Finley watched, a slow smile spread across the lower face. The lips were almost black from the pressure of engorged blood, and the huge teeth were a dirty gray. The eyes were hidden in shadow, but Finley had no doubt that Wormboy could see them. The Stevie Blues howled suddenly with pain and staggered back from the hole they'd made, gripping at their heads with both hands. It hit Finley and the others a moment later, and he cried out as the flesh rotted on his bones. The pain was horrendous, swamping his thoughts. His skin grew discolored and cracked apart, revealing maggots writhing in the decaying muscles. Pus and rotting tissue fell from his arms and legs. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't real, but his body believed it. Wormboy was playing his mind games again. Finley squeezed his rotting hands around his sword and gun, though he could no longer feel them. How could Wormboy be doing this? There was no worm in his head, no access for the beast.
He doesn't need one. He's drawing on the collective power of all the espers he controls. Our power is nothing compared to his now. Some of the prisoners are trying to hold back. They know why we're here, but he's too strong. Too strong. You're our only chance, Finley. It's harder for him to reach you because you're not an esper. Kill him. Kill the beast. Before our bodies really believe what they're being told. And run for real. He's winning, Finley. He's killing us.
Finley could dimly hear distant screams from the surrounding espers in their cells, goaded to action by the spur in their brains. They were killing their only hope, and they knew it. He almost lost track of himself in the vast sea of minds, but slowly, bit by bit, he curled in upon himself, shutting out everything else, drawing upon the ingrained disciplines of a fighter in the arena, where to lose concentration even for a moment could mean your death. He pulled back from the brink, but still he was helpless in the grip of such power. They were all helpless, alone in the dark with Worm Boy. And then, something wonderful happened. One of those minds exploded in a searing blast of light that threw back the darkness. One mind, pure and potent, reached out and gathered all the captive minds into its fold and pulled them together in a single vast cry of outrage. Once Jenny Psycho, now fully Mater Mundi, she gave them hope and strength and bound them in a single Gestalt mind, fully the equal of the Empire's greatest Esper creation. But only the equal. Thousands of minds swept this way and that in the Gestalt, torn between Mater Mundi's sheer power and the controlling worms hotwired directly into their brains. The prisoners were literally fighting themselves. Finley was there too, snatched up into the Gestalt by the sheer power of what was happening. He could feel Evangeline there beside him, somehow always just out of reach. Wormboy's power beat around him like the thunder of huge wings, grasping for him, but unable to make contact. He had no worm in his brain, and more importantly, he was not one man, one mind, but two. Even as Wormboy's thoughts curled around Finley, pulling him in, the masked gladiator remained free, unnoticed, waiting. Finley plunged deep into Wormboy's mind, seemingly just another small victory over Mater Mundi, another spark guttering in the darkness. But the moment Wormboy clamped down on Finley Campbell, the masked gladiator was released. He sprang free, arrayed as always in his familiar armor and featureless steel helm, his sword Morgana in his hands. Wormboy sensed something was wrong and tried to recoil, but he had already brought his killer deep into his own mind. The masked gladiator saw the single shining light in the middle of everything that was Wormboy's private self, his inner being, his soul, and it seemed a very small thing indeed. It was the easiest thing in the world for the masked gladiator to step forward, take off his helm, and blow it out like a candle. Darkness slammed down as Wormboy died, and his last fading scream was drowned out by the roar of triumph as the prisoners of Silo 9 burst out of his grasp, free at last. Finley Campbell, complete again, watched them go, and then strolled casually out into the light to take his vows. Only when he dropped back into his own head, opened his eyes and looked around, he found himself in the middle of utter chaos. People were running everywhere, shouting and screaming, and the lights were flashing on and off. Evangeline was clinging to his arm, shouting in his ear, and Pindar was staring wildly about him. Finley shook his head and made himself concentrate on what Evangeline was trying to tell him.
Finley, we have to get out of here. The prisoners have all broken free and Mater Mundi is blasting away out of the prison. The authorities have panicked and called in the Imperial Guards. Thousands of them are fighting it out with thousands of espers and clones. The guards are getting their ass kicked, but there's so many of them. They're everywhere. They'll be here soon. We have to get out of here, Finley, while we still can.
All right. I'm back. How many of us are there?
Just us three. The others are off fighting. The Stevie Blues are in their element. Half of Silo 9 must be burning by now.
So what's the problem? We'll just go back the way we came and get out under cover of the fighting.
You don't understand. They're bringing in S-blockers, hundreds of them. Our people will be helpless, unarmed. The guards will slaughter them.
Finley raised a hand to interrupt him, and thought hard. They couldn't have come this far, achieved so much, just to fail now.
I've got an idea. I have an implant, a very tricky piece of quality tech that enables me to sneak past security systems without being noticed. We'll patch it into the prison systems via my comm implant, knock out the surveillance, and then everyone makes a run for it. A lot of people won't make it, but most should. It's not much of a plan, but it's the best chance we've got.
Do it. I'll pass the word to the others.
Pindar turned away, and both of them concentrated in their separate ways. Finley and Evangeline made it out. Pindar didn't. Gut shot by a guard he never saw. Finley killed the guard, but it didn't make any difference. They carried Pindar as far as they could, and left him where he died. They never did find Evangeline's friend, the one she'd gone in specially to look for. The Stevie Blues got out, riding a wall of flame. More than half the prisoners managed to escape in the end, streaming out under the unseeing eyes of the security cameras before the S-blockers could be deployed. But hundreds of Espers and clones died anyway, and more were captured. They were led away in restraints, neutered by the S-blockers. Many suicided rather than be taken again. The man who used to be called Hood walked unhurriedly through Silo 9's corridors, his cowl pushed well back to reveal himself as the Lord High Dram. There were bodies everywhere, and he had to step over and around them. Parts of the prison were still burning, and Wormboy was dead. On the whole, he had to admit his operation to crush the underground had not been as successful as he'd hoped. But a great many Espers and clones were dead, and the guards had captured as many as had escaped. The underground's plan to break out all the prisoners had been foiled. The prison could be repaired, and they could always grow another Wormboy. Eventually. More importantly, Mater Mundi had been forced to reveal herself, and the extent of her powers. And that was worth a great many dead guards. She'd find it a lot harder to find a bushel to hide her light under now. The underground would be scattered again, thanks to his knowledge of their inner workings. His people were already raiding the appropriate locations. It would take the underground years to recover and regroup. As Hood, he could identify many names and faces, including Finley Campbell, Evangeline Schreck, and Valentine Wolfe. Finley didn't matter anymore, but the other knowledge should give him great power over the Schrecks and the Wolves. They would be only too willing to bow to him to prevent their names becoming a scandal. Power like that was worth a lot. The Empress would take steps to see that this operation was regarded by everyone as a great success, playing up the gains and turning a blind eye to the losses. It should be more than enough to justify her making him her official consort. Dram smiled and smiled as he walked, and the guards gave him plenty of room, especially when he started to chuckle aloud.